Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe, as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. It was just after dusk, the time when the world seemed to settle into the quiet that comes with evening. I was getting ready for a typical night of work. My partner and I had been fielding inquiries from a couple of different ads, trying to see who would bite. One message caught our attention, a John who seemed well off and specific about what he wanted. We exchanged messages for about half an hour before agreeing to a house call. The address he gave me was across the city, nestled in one of those wealthy neighborhoods where the houses looked more like mini mansions. It was clear this was no ordinary client. I messaged him as I was getting ready to leave, just to confirm our appointment. He said he'd be upstairs working on his computer, told me to let him know when I arrived. Simple enough, thought my partner, and I hopped into the car, driving in silence as we headed toward the upscale part of town. Normally, we didn't think too much of these calls, but tonight a strange feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Something about the whole situation felt off. Still, we pressed on. It was too good of an opportunity to pass up. When we arrived, that uneasy feeling only grew. The house was enormous, with large windows and a well-manicured lawn. It had that cold, detached air that a lot of rich people's homes do, beautiful, but lifeless. I messaged the John, letting him know we had arrived, but received no response. That wasn't too unusual. Maybe he was just busy. I stepped out of the car, but when I did, my partner followed me, which he rarely did. He must have felt the tension to as we approached the house. The first thing I noticed was the door. It was massive, made of dark, heavy wood with intricate designs carved into it. A frosted glass window sat in the center, hiding the view of the interior. I knocked softly, but to my surprise the door swung open slightly, as if it had been left ajar. Instantly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at my partner, but he motioned for me to go inside. My legs were heavy with hesitation as I pushed the door open wider. The sight that greeted me made my heart race in confusion. The entryway led into a grand living space with high ceilings and a crackling fire in the fireplace. But something was wrong. There was no furniture. The room was empty, save for the fire that burned brightly in the center. No couches, no chairs, not even a rug on the floor. The walls were bare, no pictures or decorations, just white and sterile. To the left, there was a dark doorway leading into what seemed to be another room. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, not sure what to do next. My mind raced, trying to make sense of why anyone would live in a house like this, with no furniture, no sign of life, just a fire in the middle of it all. Before I could say anything, my partner stepped past me into the house. He moved with more confidence than I felt, peering into the dark doorway on the left. I wanted to tell him to stop, that something wasn't right, but my voice caught in my throat. "Hello," he called out into the darkness. His voice echoed slightly, adding to the eeriness of the place. There was no response. He called out again, a little louder this time. "Hello." Then, suddenly, he recoiled, his body jerking back as if he'd seen something that shocked him. Without a word, he turned to me and shoved me out of the doorway, his face pale and tense. That was all I needed. My legs finally obeyed the fear that had been gripping me since we arrived. I sprinted back to the car, my heart pounding in my chest. We didn't speak as we drove away, the tension between us thick. The silence was deafening, the air in the car heavy with unspoken questions. I stared straight ahead, replaying the scene over, and over in my mind, trying to piece together what had just happened. Eventually, we pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour pharmacy. The neon lights from the sign buzzed faintly as we sat in the car, still in silence. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I turned to him, my voice barely above a whisper. What was in that room? He didn't answer right away, his face still drained of color. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost too soft to hear. An air mattress, he said slowly, with 2 people on it, sleeping ... I hope my stomach dropped, sleeping in an empty house with no furniture, in the dead of night. Something about the way he said it, so uncertain, so unnerved, told me that whatever he had seen, it was far from ordinary. We didn't go back. We didn't talk about it after that night either. There was no explanation, no way to make sense of what we had encountered. But the image of that empty house, the fire in the hearth, and the shadowy figures on that air mattress still haunt me long after we drove away. I recently read a story on Let's Not Meet that brought back some old memories of my dad's crazy ex-girlfriend. This happened when I was about 8 or 9 years old, so it must have been around 1997 that my parents had divorced several years before, so my little sister and I, 2 years younger, spent every other weekend with our dad. One weekend, he introduced us to his new girlfriend, Rachel. She was a tall, blonde woman, and I remember Dad mentioning that she had won some sort of beauty pageant. At first, I thought she was great. Those early months getting to know Rachel were fun. She seemed nice, and she had a couple of cool pets, a cuddly gray parrot and a pet raven that could talk. As a kid, I was beyond excited about that. But after a while, things started to get weird. I noticed Rachel had some odd behaviors. She'd say strange things or act out in bizarre ways. Over time, we saw less of her, and eventually, Dad told us they had broken up. He also warned us not to talk to her if she ever showed up, especially at school, which was strange and unsettling for me to hear. Not long after, Rachel's behavior escalated, and she started harassing my dad. She would randomly show up at places we went to on the weekends, trying to talk to us. She also called our house nonstop, crying or making threats. Dad had to unplug the phone to get some peace. Years later, I learned that Rachel had even threatened to kill me and my sister several times. Dad had gotten a restraining order against her, but that didn't stop her. Rachel vandalized my dad's car, broke into his business to trash it, and even stole a lot of money from him, money he never got back. She went so far as to send threatening letters to my mom, even though my parents had remained good friends after their divorce. It all culminated with a letter from the authorities. That letter accused my dad of being a child molester. I still vividly remember when Mom sat me and my sister down in our room, holding the letter. She had this deep look of concern on her face as she asked if Dad had ever touched us inappropriately. Of course, he never had. It was later revealed that Rachel had falsely accused him in a desperate attempt to prevent him from seeing us. I remember feeling so angry and upset that she would go to such cruel lengths. The last memory I have of Rachel happened a few weeks before Christmas. My sister and I were at Dad's apartment for the weekend. The living room had a huge window that stretched from the floor to the ceiling, and next to it was a glass door that led to the patio. The patio bordered a lawn, and beyond that was a tall hedge. On this particular night, it was pitch black outside since the outdoor lights were off. We were sitting on the couch watching TV, when I suddenly heard a sharp scratching noise coming from the window. It sounded like someone was clawing at the glass. The sofa was right in front of the window, so I had my back to it. I slowly turned around, my heart pounding as if I were being watched. But all I could see was my own reflection in the dark. Dad must have heard the noise because he got up to turn on the patio lights. The second the lights flooded the outside, I found myself staring straight into the face of a smiling blonde woman, Rachel, peering into the living room. Needless to say, I screamed. My sister and I jumped off the couch like it was on fire and ran behind Dad. When I looked back at the window, Rachel had her hands cupped against the glass, trying to see inside. She was standing right next to the patio door. I tugged on Dad's shirt and whispered, asking if the door was locked as I watched her reach for the handle. The flash of doubt that crossed Dad's face still haunts me to this day. Rachel looked completely deranged as she yanked on the door handle, pausing occasionally to peer through the glass. Despite everything, Dad remained calm. He ushered us around the corner, telling us to stay out of sight while he walked toward the patio door. We begged him not to go outside, fearing she might have a weapon. Instead, Dad cracked the door open, firmly holding the handle, and asked her what the hell she was doing in his backyard. Rachel tried to sweet-talk her way in, smiling and tossing her hair, but Dad wouldn't budge. He told her to leave or he'd call the police. Eventually, she backed down, but not before leaving a pile of Christmas presents on the patio. Once Rachel was out of sight, Dad went outside to make sure she had left and brought the presents back inside. None of us wanted anything to do with them. Something about them felt deeply unsettling. So we tossed the gifts in the trash, still fully wrapped, and that was the last we ever saw of Rachel. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling of her face pressed against the glass as she tried to claw her way back into our lives. Earlier this summer, I had finally gotten my driving license for a 50cc moped, which is a pretty common and popular thing here in Europe. At 16, the freedom that came with it was exhilarating. I was hyped to ride around with my friends, explore places I could never have gone without my moped, and just soak in the warm summer air. For the first few days, it was everything I imagined: perfect rides, beautiful weather, and endless fun. But then one night, things took a turn that still haunts me. It was one of those golden summer evenings. The sky was glowing, and the air felt alive with warmth. My friends and I decided to take a ride along some smaller gravel roads in the countryside, just cruising and having a good time. We rode for about an hour, feeling the wind rush past us, exploring farms and small villages scattered across the landscape. It was pure bliss, but eventually my friends had to head home. It must have been around 1 or 2 a.m. by then, but I wasn't ready to call it a night. I decided to stay out on my own for a while, riding through the countryside, listening to music in my headphones, and just enjoying the moment. There's something special about riding, and everything around you is calm and still no cars. No people, just you and the open road. I found myself riding towards this tiny village surrounded by fields and farms, slowing down a bit because you never know when a tractor or some farm vehicle might appear out of nowhere. As I left the village behind and made my way toward a bigger road, I realized how quickly the light was fading. The sun had all but disappeared, and the countryside was swallowed in darkness. It had been a great ride, but I figure it was time to head home before my parents realized I'd been out this late way past curfew. The problem was, home was nearly 30 kilometers away, and to make matters worse, the only road that could get me back fast enough was the highway. Technically, I wasn't even supposed to be on that highway with my moped. 50cc mopeds aren't allowed there since the speed limit is 100 kilometers per hour. But I didn't care. I needed to get home, and I thought I could make it without any trouble. So I gunned it, riding as fast as my moped could manage, around 80 to 90 kilometers per hour, just hoping to get back before 3 a.m. After about 15 minutes of riding, I noticed something strange. Up ahead, there was a car pulled over to the side of the road, its headlights glowing in the dark. It was just sitting there, engine running, lights on, but no movement. For some reason, it made me feel uneasy, but I pushed the thought aside. It was probably just someone having car trouble or taking a break, right? I kept riding, focused on getting home, but then just a few minutes later, I realized the car was no longer parked. It was speeding up behind me. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. Maybe they'd finished whatever they were doing and were back on the road. But soon, it became clear that the car wasn't just speeding up, it was coming for me. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. My moped couldn't go faster than 90 kilometers per hour, so there was no way I could outrun a car. Within moments, it caught up to me and started to pass on my left. I glanced over, and that's when I saw him. The man behind the wheel was covered in blood. His clothes were stained, his face smeared. But it wasn't just the blood that sent a chill down my spine, it was the way he was staring at me. His eyes were wide, almost wild, and he had this twisted smile on his face, like he was enjoying the fear he knew he was causing me. For a split second, I wondered if I was imagining it, if the darkness and my exhaustion were playing tricks on me. But no, he was real. He didn't just pass me and drive off. No, he rode beside me for what felt like an eternity, keeping pace with my moped, his eyes locked on me. I could barely breathe. My heart was pounding in my ears, my hands gripping the handlebars so tight I thought I might snap them. Every so often, he'd glance at the road, then back at me, that smile never fading. Then, as if to make things even more terrifying, he slowly raised his hand and waved at me, just a casual, almost friendly wave. But it wasn't friendly, it was sinister. After the wave, he placed his finger to his lips, shushing me with an exaggerated gesture, as if telling me to keep quiet about whatever this was, and just like that, he sped off, taking an exit ramp that led to a smaller road. As he disappeared into the darkness, I noticed something else. His car had no license plates. My blood ran cold. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't just some random dude on a late-night drive. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept riding, full throttle, desperate to get as far away from that car and that man as possible. By the time I got home, I was shaking. I parked my moped, stumbled inside, and collapsed onto my bed, my mind racing with questions. Who was that guy? Why was he covered in blood? What would have happened if he'd done more than just stare? I still don't know the answers. But what I do know is that night was the creepiest, most terrifying experience of my life. And whoever that man was, I hope I never cross paths with him again. I'm an 18-year-old college student, and this all started during my summer job. On my first day, I was sitting in the lobby, waiting to clock in, when a guy approached me. He was polite and charming, so I gave him my number. He was 23, told me he had his own moving company, and mentioned he visited my job often. He asked me a few questions, including if I still lived with my parents. In my excitement, I naively told him yes, but that I was moving out soon. I regretted sharing that information almost immediately. After he left, my manager came over, looking concerned. She asked if he had made me uncomfortable, what exactly he said, and if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but her reaction made me second-guess my decision. I decided not to text him back. A few days later, he came up to me at work and asked why I had ghosted him. We chatted a bit, and I felt maybe I had been too quick to judge, so I decided to text him again. However, after a few messages, I got a bad feeling and blocked him. Then things got worse. One day after work, I was heading out, and he followed me. I hadn't even realized he was at my job that day. He started asking me what bus I was taking, to which I responded it wasn't his business. He quickly said, "I'm not a weirdo or anything, I just ride the bus too." Then he asked if I had moved into my new place yet. He didn't even acknowledge that I had blocked him. I kept walking, and he eventually said, "Okay, have a great evening," before going the other way. I saw him twice more before I quit that job. The first time, he came in and just looked around. I spotted him as I was walking out of the back and immediately ran back to high. A minute later, he was gone. The final time, it was during a rush, and he asked my other manager if he could talk to me. Thinking I knew him, she said yes. He asked how I was doing and then, once again, immediately brought up the new place. I gave him a short no and went back to work. He left after that. He never ordered anything when he came in, just hung around and left after asking me weird questions. I quit that job 2 weeks ago, thinking I was done with him. But then I started college. Imagine my shock when, during my first week at community college, I ran into him again. Our class was outside, working in the garden near a building called the Father and Son Center. I had no idea that place existed, and I was focused on my work when I saw a scruffy-looking guy approaching. I didn't recognize him at first since he always wore a hat and looked more put together at my job. He started talking to me, asking what our class was doing. I thought he might have been campus staff, so I engaged in the conversation. Then he said, "So you're a student? I didn't know that." That's when I realized who he was. I asked if I knew him, and he reminded me he was the guy from my job. Immediately after, he asked, "What's your major? And did you move into your place yet?" I was creeped out, so I told him whether or not I'd moved wasn't his concern. I asked why he wanted to know, and he said, "I want to chill with you." I told him no again and reminded him that I didn't know him, so there was no way I'd invite a stranger to my place. He had the audacity to ask, "How long until I can come over?" I hadn't seen him in 2 weeks, yet here he was at my school. I asked where he came from, and he told me he worked in the kitchen at the Father and Son Center. But he didn't look like he was on duty, and I couldn't figure out why he had left his job to come outside and talk to me. Then he asked if my apartment was on a specific street, which really freaked me out. While he was wrong about the street, it was the same name as the bus I'd take. I got up and walked away, and he let me go, saying, "Well, happy gardening." As I walked away, I kept an eye on him. He wandered back toward the building, moving slowly and creepily. One of my classmates saw the whole interaction and asked if I knew him. I told her I didn't. We both watched as he reached the parking lot and started talking to a group of guys who had come out of the building. Then another guy from that group came over to where we were gardening and started asking a classmate what we were doing and what class we were in. The classmate, unaware of what had just happened, gave him that information. Now I'm paranoid that this guy has been stalking me, and I'm genuinely scared. I thought quitting my job would be the end of it, but now I feel unsafe at school and even at the bus station. I don't know what to do. I'm still shaken up while typing this, so please bear with me. I live on the outskirts of one of the largest cities in the Northeast, in a quiet area that feels more like a small town than part of a metropolis. My gym is in the suburbs, and after a tough workout one day, I was headed home, looking forward to relaxing, petting my dog, and taking a much-needed shower. I never imagined that what started as a simple drive home would end in a terrifying chase that left me feeling helpless and vulnerable. To get back into my section of the city from the suburbs, there's an old four-lane bridge that crosses the river into my neighborhood. The lanes aren't well marked, but everyone respects the unspoken rule, 2 cars to a lane. I was driving across the bridge in the right lane, intending to go straight. The left lane is typically for turning, but as I approached the end of the bridge, I noticed the car in the left lane was edging into my lane, its front tire almost a foot into my path. I had to swerve slightly, even hopping up onto the curb just to avoid hitting him. I glanced over at the driver, not to make any gestures or escalate things, but more out of frustration, like, "What the hell are you doing?" I didn't think much of it. After that, the light turned green, and I drove across the bridge. Oddly enough, I noticed in my rearview mirror that the car, which was supposed to be turning left, went straight too. That was the first red flag. As I continued driving through my semi-residential street, stopping at each stop sign, I realized this car was still behind me. It wasn't out of the ordinary at first, just a car in traffic, but something about it felt off. I glanced in the mirror again and saw an illuminated Uber sign on the windshield, which gave me a strange sense of comfort. "Oh, he's just working," I told myself. But when I reached another main road and stopped at the light, I saw him turn off that Uber light, and something deep inside me screamed that something was wrong. I wasn't sure why, but the simple act of him turning off that light felt like a warning. Whatever little comfort I had from thinking he was just an Uber driver on duty vanished. I decided to test the waters. As the light turned green, I made a left onto a smaller residential street, hoping the Uber would go straight. But no, he made the turn to. My heart started racing, and I tried to keep calm. I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid or if something bad was really about to happen. I made another turn, and sure enough, the Uber turned with me. By this point, he was following me so closely that his front bumper was practically kissing mine. That's when I knew I was in trouble. Despite my usual calm and composed nature, I work a buttoned-up office job. I'm soft-spoken, and I'm not easily rattled. No pushover. I'm a big guy, standing at 6 feet 5 inches, and weighing around 120 pounds, most of it muscle. I've got tattoos that make me look intimidating to most people, but none of that mattered now. This wasn't about physical strength or looks. This was a real threat, and I didn't know what this guy was capable of. For a moment, I thought about pulling over and confronting him, but with gun violence being so rampant in the city, I quickly dismissed that idea. My main focus now was getting away and making sure this maniac didn't follow me home. I turned onto the highway, thinking maybe I could shake him off there, but he followed me again, cutting across lanes and speeding up to stay on my tail. I made the first right turn I could, leading him down a maze of back streets, zigzagging through the neighborhood. At this point, I wasn't paying attention to stop signs, one-way streets, or speed limits. I just needed to get away, but no matter how many sharp turns I made, this guy stayed glued to my bumper. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the panic started to set in. This wasn't just some bad driver or someone with road rage. He was pursuing me with a purpose, and I had no idea what that purpose was. I needed to find a safe place, but every turn I made, every shortcut I took, He was right there behind me. Then I spotted a fast food restaurant parking lot that provided a shortcut to the main road. I took a chance and sped through the lot, hoping it would throw him off. But he followed, speeding after me. That's when I started to lose hope. If he was willing to follow me through all of that, what else was he willing to do? I debated my next move. The police station was about a 10-minute drive away, but there were several lights and crosswalks between me and safety. I didn't want to risk stopping at a red light, giving him a chance to get out of his car and confront me. But I had to head in that direction, hoping and praying I wouldn't hit any lights as I turned out of the parking lot. My worst fear became reality: a red light with a car already stopped ahead of me. Oncoming traffic was to my left, and there was no way I could make a clean turn. My mind was racing. I knew it was risky, irresponsible even, but I didn't hesitate. I swerved into the oncoming lane and made a sharp left turn down a one-way street. Going against traffic, horns blared, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't see his headlights. I kept driving, making random turns down side streets, trying to throw him off completely. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of an apartment complex, turned off my car, and laid my seat all the way back. My entire body was shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I couldn't believe what had just happened. After a few deep breaths, I called the non-emergency police line, still too frazzled to dial 911. The lady on the phone was less than helpful, telling me I should call 911 if it was an emergency. I tried to explain the situation, but without a clear description of the guy's face or the car's details, there wasn't much they could do. They said they'd file it as a disturbance and told me to head home, but I wasn't taking any chances. I parked several blocks away from my house, changed clothes in my car, and put on a hat to avoid being recognized. As I walked home, my eyes scanned every passing car, half convinced that I'd see his again. I thought I caught a glimpse of it turning down a nearby street, but I couldn't be sure. Even if it was him, I told myself he wouldn't recognize me out of the car. Now I'm home, sitting here with my dog by my side and a drink in my hand, trying to process what happened. I feel helpless. I've never felt this vulnerable in my life. I'm scared to drive through the city, afraid I might run into him again. I'm terrified that he could find out where I live, show up at my house, and hurt me or my family. For the first time ever, I'm seriously considering buying a weapon legally, of course just in case I ever have to defend myself. I don't know what this guy's deal was or why he felt the need to chase me down like that, but I hope I never see him again. To the deranged Uber driver who chased me through the back streets of my city for no reason, let's not meet. Living in a small rural college town always felt safe to me. Nestled between rolling hills and dotted with charming cafes and old brick buildings, it was the perfect blend of cozy and lively, especially during the school year. Even on nights when the campus was deserted, I could stroll through the grounds without a second thought. The university police constantly patrol, and the tight-knit community made everyone feel like a familiar face. After several years here, I had grown fond of its peaceful, quiet atmosphere. The 4th of July was one of the biggest events in our town, and it was something I always looked forward to. The entire community came together to celebrate with a full day of festivities, from a parade in the morning to craft fairs and a dog show in the afternoon, all leading up to the much-anticipated fireworks display by the lake. The sense of togetherness on that day was unmatched. and the sight of families, tourists, and students mingling made it feel like a big, vibrant celebration this year. I was particularly excited because my boyfriend, who lived about an hour and a half away, was making the trip to watch the fireworks with me. He had just finished a long shift at work, but despite the distance and his exhaustion, he drove to spend the evening with me. We had planned out our day watching the parade, grabbing food from the trucks, and finishing it off with the fireworks by the lake. It seemed like it was going to be a perfect day. After spending the afternoon at the craft fair, we decided to get some ice cream from one of the food trucks parked near the campus. The sun had begun to dip, casting a golden hue over the field where people were gathering to secure their spots for the fireworks. We still had plenty of time before the show started, so I suggested a detour. There was a small pasture on the outskirts of the campus, not far from the lake, where a few horses were grazing. I had always loved animals, and it seemed like a peaceful way to kill some time before the evening festivities. My boyfriend agreed, and we made our way toward the pasture, walking along a quiet path lined with trees. The chatter of the crowd in the distance slowly faded, leaving only the sounds of nature around us, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of food truck generators, and the soft clop of the horses as they moved about in the field. It was there, by the fence of the pasture, that I first noticed him. He stood alone just a few yards away from the horses, leaning against a tree with his arms crossed. At first glance, there was nothing particularly unusual about him. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and seemed to be staring at the horses, just like we were about to do. But something about him felt off. Maybe it was the way he stood so still, or the way his eyes didn't seem to focus on anything specific. The moment I saw him, a shiver ran down my spine, and I felt a sudden urge to turn around and walk the other way. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. It was a public place, and there were people not too far away. Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. My boyfriend noticed my hesitation and asked if everything was okay. I forced a smile and nodded, but my eyes kept flicking back to the man. As we approached the fence, I tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the horses. They were beautiful creatures, their manes catching the last rays of sunlight as they moved lazily across the field. I reached out to grab my boyfriend's hand, seeking comfort, but my gaze drifted again to the man under the tree. He hadn't moved. His eyes were now locked on me. My breath caught in my throat. There was something unsettling about his stare, something predatory. He didn't smile, didn't nod in acknowledgement, didn't even blink. He just stood there, watching. I felt my heart begin to race, a growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. I wanted to leave, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. My boyfriend, sensing my discomfort, turned to look at the man as well. He stiffened beside me. "Let's go," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. We turned and started walking back toward the main field, trying to act casual, but I could feel the man's eyes boring into my back with every step we took. The further we walked, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. I resisted the urge to turn around to confirm that he was still there, but my instincts were screaming at me to move faster. We made it back to the field where the crowd had gathered, the noise and lights offering a sense of relief. I glanced over my shoulder, but the man was gone. The tree where he had stood was empty, the horses grazing peacefully, oblivious to the tension that had gripped me just moments ago. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Even as we spread out our blanket and settled in to watch the fireworks, I kept scanning the crowd, half expecting to see the man standing somewhere in the distance, still watching. But he never appeared again. The fireworks began, lighting up the night sky in brilliant bursts of color, but I found it hard to enjoy them. My mind kept replaying the moment by the pastor, the man's cold, unwavering stare, the way he seemed to focus on me as if I were the only person in the world. When the show ended and the crowd began to disperse, my boyfriend and I walked quickly back to the car. We didn't talk much on the drive home, both of us lost in our thoughts. I knew he had felt the same unease I did, even though neither of us had said it aloud. To this day, I don't know who that man was or why he made me feel the way he did. Maybe it was nothing, just a random stranger who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the way he looked at me, with those cold, unblinking eyes, made me feel like I had narrowly escaped something far worse than just a creepy encounter. Since that night, I've been more cautious, even in my small, cozy town. What had once felt safe and familiar now holds a shadow of unease, a reminder that danger can sometimes hide in the most unexpected places. It was the 4th of July, one of the biggest days in our small college town. Every year, people from all over gathered for parades, craft fairs, and, of course, the grand fireworks display by the lake. My boyfriend had driven an hour and a half after work just to spend the evening with me, and we were looking forward to a quiet night, watching the fireworks under the stars. After grabbing some ice cream from the food trucks, we decided to take a detour before heading to the lake. Not far from the campus was a small pasture where a few horses grazed, and I had always loved stopping by to watch them whenever I had the chance. The day had been filled with excitement, and the idea of spending a few moments in the peaceful countryside before the fireworks seemed perfect. The evening light was fading, casting a warm glow over the field. The horses stood silently, their manes rippling in the gentle breeze as they lazily chewed on the grass. I reached out and grabbed my boyfriend's hand, feeling a sense of contentment as we watched them from the fence. But that peaceful moment didn't last long. As we stood there, admiring the horses, a voice cut through the quiet. "Hey, you in the white hat." My boyfriend was wearing a white baseball cap, and it took a few seconds for us to realize that the shout was directed at him. We both turned toward the voice. A man was walking toward us, waving his arms to get our attention. He looked rough, to say the least. His clothes were old and dirty, his hair unkempt, and he had a worn-out guitar strapped to his back. There was something off about the way he moved, almost too eager, as if he had been waiting for someone to notice him. His eyes had a strange gleam to them, and immediately I felt a knot form in my stomach. The man came up to us with a wide grin, his teeth yellowed and uneven. "Hey," he said, breathless as if he had been running. "My friends dropped me off for the fireworks, and I'm just trying to figure out where everyone's going to watch them. You guys know where the best spot is." My boyfriend, ever the friendly one, smiled back and began chatting with him, explaining where most people would gather by the lake to watch the fireworks. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was something about the man's energy too intense, too eager, that made my skin crawl. His clothes looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks, and the guitar slung over his shoulder seemed out of place, like a prop that didn't quite fit the story he was telling. I tried to be polite, even throwing in a comment about how great the fireworks were every year, hoping that would be enough to end the conversation and send him on his way. But he wasn't taking the hint. Instead, he lingered, nodding along to everything my boyfriend said, but his eyes darted between the two of us in a way that made me feel like he was studying us, sizing us up. The unease that had started as a small knot in my stomach was now growing into a full-blown sense of dread. My boyfriend, oblivious to the discomfort I was feeling, continued chatting, even offering to show the man where we were planning to sit. But something about this man, his disheveled appearance, his overly friendly demeanor just didn't sit right with me. I tugged lightly on my boyfriend's arm, trying to signal that it was time to go, but he didn't seem to catch on. The man noticed, though. He turned his gaze directly at me, his smile widening in a way that felt more sinister than friendly. "You okay there?" he asked, his voice dripping with a strange mix of concern and amusement. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile, my heart racing. "I'm fine, just ... We should probably head to the lake before it gets too crowded," I said, my voice a little shakier than I intended. The man laughed, a low, unsettling sound. "Oh, don't worry," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "We've got plenty of time. The fireworks don't start for a while." He took a step closer, his grin never faltering. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Everything in me was screaming to get away from this guy, but I didn't want to cause a scene. My boyfriend, still trying to be polite, made one last attempt to guide the conversation back to the fireworks, but it was clear that the man wasn't interested in the display anymore. Without warning, the man reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to my boyfriend with a grin. "Here, take this," he said. "You never know when you might need a favor." My boyfriend hesitated for a moment, but took the paper, folding it up and slipping it into his back pocket. "Thanks, man," he said, his voice a bit more guarded now. Sensing the shift in the conversation, the man nodded, his smile still plastered on his face. "Well, I'll be seeing you around," he said, his voice low and cryptic. He turned and walked back toward the tree line, his figure disappearing into the growing shadows. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we stood there in silence for a few moments, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. Finally, my boyfriend turned to me, his brow furrowed. "That was weird, right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded, my heart still racing. "Yeah, really weird." We quickly made our way back to the lake. The man's strange grin burned into my mind, even as the fireworks lit up the sky in brilliant bursts of color. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something far more dangerous than we had realized. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, I asked my boyfriend what was on the crumpled piece of paper the man had given him. He pulled it out of his pocket and unfolded it. It was blank. To this day, I don't know what the man's intentions were or why he approached us in such a strange way, but the memory of his unnerving grin and the empty piece of paper still haunts me. It's a reminder that even in the safest, coziest of towns, there are moments that can make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. Living in a small college town, nestled in the quiet countryside, had always felt like a dream. I loved how peaceful and familiar everything was, where you could walk home late at night and never feel threatened. The annual 4th of July celebration was one of the highlights of the year, and this time my boyfriend, who lived about an hour and a half away, had driven up just to watch the fireworks with me. We had spent the day enjoying the festivities, but as the sun began to set, what should have been a fun evening took a strange and uncomfortable turn. We were on our way to the lake where the fireworks show would take place. The plan was simple: grab some ice cream, find a good spot, and settle in for the evening. But along the way, we decided to make a quick stop at a small pasture where a few horses were grazing. It was a beautiful, serene moment, just the two of us standing by the fence, watching the horses against the backdrop of a fading sunset. Then, out of nowhere, a voice called out, shattering the peace. "Hey, you in the white hat," my boyfriend, wearing his usual white baseball cap, turned toward the sound. A man was walking toward us, waving his arms excitedly. He was disheveled, his clothes dirty and worn, with a guitar strapped to his back. From the moment I saw him, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. The man stopped in front of us, breathing heavily as though he had been running. "My friends dropped me off for the fireworks," he explained, his eyes darting between the two of us. "Do you know where the best spot is to watch them?" My boyfriend, always the friendly one, started chatting with him, explaining where most people gathered by the lake. But the man wasn't just asking for directions, he was lingering, too eager to talk, his energy far too intense for a casual interaction. I could feel my skin crawl as he shifted from foot to foot, his gaze never settling. I tried to play along, keeping the conversation polite, but I was already hoping he'd move on. Instead, things got stranger. The man began asking personal questions: if we were students, how long we'd lived here, and where we were from. At first, my boyfriend answered casually, mentioning his favorite football team. That seemed to trigger something in the stranger. His face lit up, and he suddenly claimed he'd just written a song about that very team. Before we could react, he started reaching for his guitar. Both my boyfriend and I immediately protested. "Oh, there's no need to play it," I said quickly, waving my hands. But he wasn't having it. No, you gotta hear this," he insisted, pulling the guitar off his back and adjusting the strap. What followed was one of the most awkward, uncomfortable moments I've ever experienced. The man launched into a bizarre 15-minute freestyle rap. It was filled with clunky rhymes and nonsensical lyrics, all mumbled in a strange rhythm. My boyfriend and I exchanged sideways glances, struggling to suppress our laughter. At first, it was almost comical, but as the minutes dragged on, it became clear this man wasn't going anywhere. The sunset deepened, casting the field in shadows, and I watched as families and groups of friends began heading toward the lake for the fireworks. I desperately wanted to leave, but the man kept blocking our path, going on and on, lost in his world of gibberish rhymes and awkward strumming. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stopped playing. I thought we'd finally be able to slip away, but no, he wasn't done. The man started asking even more personal questions, his tone shifting from friendly to unsettlingly curious. "So, are you two siblings?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "No, we're dating," my boyfriend explained with a polite smile, trying to steer the conversation back to normalcy. But that only seemed to excite the man. His eyes lit up, and he began mumbling something about finding the one, and how relationships were divine connections. Then, out of nowhere, he dropped the bombshell. "I'm the Archangel Michael, you know. I've been sent here for a reason. Gonna run for mayor in 2028. I froze, unsure how to respond. My boyfriend managed a nervous laugh, but I could tell he was starting to feel just as uneasy as I was. The man kept talking, weaving in and out of bizarre topics: angels, politics, love, all while holding that unsettling grin. Then he leaned in closer to my boyfriend, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You know," he said, staring intently into my boyfriend's eyes, "blue-eyed people, they're closer to God." I felt my stomach twist. My boyfriend shifted uncomfortably, glancing at me for reassurance. The man's gaze was unblinking, as if he were waiting for some kind of response, some validation of his delusions. "We really should get going," I finally said, forcing a smile and tugging on my boyfriend's arm. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring, as if he hadn't heard me at all. For a moment I thought we were trapped in that bizarre conversation forever, stuck with this man who seemed incapable of understanding boundaries. Then, finally, the man stepped back, his eyes still fixed on us. "Well, it was good meeting you," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't quite ready to let go. Double quotes, yeah. "You too," my boyfriend muttered, already backing away. We practically sprinted toward the lake after that, my heart pounding in my chest. Even as the fireworks exploded in the sky above us, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered from our encounter with the stranger. His cryptic remarks, his insistence on playing that awkward song, and his intense, almost obsessive interest in us left a chill that no amount of holiday cheer could shake. Even now I sometimes wonder what his story really was. Who was that man, and why had he chosen us to fixate on? One thing's for sure, I'll never look at a 4th of July celebration the same way again. Living in a small college town had always felt safe and comforting to me, with the sense of community, the late-night campus patrols, and familiar faces everywhere. I'd never had a reason to feel uneasy. The 4th of July was a particularly big deal around here, with parades, food trucks, and a grand fireworks show by the lake. That year, my boyfriend, who lived about an hour and a half away, made the drive to join me for the celebrations. We spent the day enjoying the festivities, but as the sun began to set, the evening took a strange and unsettling turn. We were making our way toward the lake, where crowds were gathering for the fireworks display. After grabbing some ice cream, we decided to stop and admire the horses grazing in a small pasture along the way. It was peaceful, just the two of us standing there, watching the horses under the fading sunlight. But that tranquility didn't last long. "Hey, you in the white hat," a voice suddenly called out, cutting through the quiet evening. My boyfriend, wearing his usual white baseball cap, turned to see a man walking toward us. From the moment I saw him, a chill crept up my spine. The man looked disheveled, his clothes dirty and worn, with a guitar slung across his back. His eyes were wild and his movements erratic, as though he was constantly on the verge of losing his balance. The man stopped in front of us, breathing heavily as if he'd been running. "My friends dropped me off for the fireworks," he said, his gaze shifting rapidly between the two of us. "Do you know where most people will be watching the show?" My boyfriend, always friendly and approachable, started explaining where the best spot to watch the fireworks would be. But the man wasn't just looking for directions. He lingered, his energy far too intense for what should have been a casual interaction. His eyes darted around, never settling on one thing for too long, and I could feel my skin crawl. I tried to stay polite, offering a few comments to help move the conversation along, but I was already hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But the man had other plans. He started asking personal questions, whether we were students, how long we'd lived in the town, where we were from. At first, my boyfriend answered casually, mentioning his favorite football team. That seemed to trigger something in the stranger. His eyes lit up, and suddenly he declared that he had written a song about that very team. Before we could react, he was already reaching for his guitar. "Oh, there's no need to play it," I said quickly, trying to stop what I knew was coming. But it was too late. No, you've got to hear this," he insisted, his fingers fumbling with the guitar strap as he prepared for what I assume would be a quick tune. I couldn't have been more wrong. What followed was an awkward and bizarre 15-minute freestyle rap. It was full of clunky rhymes and incoherent lyrics, mumbled in a rhythm that made no sense. My boyfriend and I exchanged uneasy glances, struggling to keep from laughing, though there was nothing funny about the situation. At first, it was just uncomfortable. But as the minutes dragged on, it became clear this man had no intention of leaving. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across across the field, I grew more anxious. Families with young children were starting to gather near the lake, and I wanted nothing more than to join them to escape this unsettling encounter. But the man continued to block our path, trapped in his world of nonsensical rhymes and erratic guitar strumming. When he finally finished, I thought we'd be able to make a quick exit. But the man wasn't done. He started asking even more personal questions, his tone shifting from friendly curiosity to something far more unsettling. "So, are you two siblings?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "No, we're dating," my boyfriend replied, trying to remain calm. That seemed to spark something in the stranger. His eyes widened, and he began muttering about finding the one and how relationships were sacred. Then, out of nowhere, he claimed to be the Archangel Michael, sent to Earth for a divine purpose. "I'm running for mayor in 2028, he added, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. My boyfriend shifted uncomfortably, his patience clearly wearing thin. The man, meanwhile, leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know," he said, his gaze fixed on my boyfriend's face, "blue-eyed people, they're closer to God." At that point, I could see my boyfriend growing increasingly uncomfortable. His hand slid into his pocket, where I knew he kept a small knife just in case. The man was stumbling around now, his mumbling growing more incoherent as he inched closer to us. I wasn't sure if he was high, mentally unstable, or both, but his behavior was becoming more erratic by the minute. Several families with young children passed by, and I seriously considered pretending to know one of them just to get out of the conversation. But I didn't want to risk angering this guy, who seemed more and more unpredictable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man decided to leave us alone. He mumbled something about heading to the lake and walked away, immediately approaching another group of people. We watched from a distance, relieved that we were no longer the focus of his attention, but also feeling sorry for the next people he'd latched onto. As we walked toward the lake, my heart was still racing. Even as the fireworks exploded overhead, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that lingered from our encounter. The man's cryptic remarks, his insistence on playing that awkward song, and his unnerving fixation on us left a chill that no amount of fireworks could dispel. Even now, I can't stop wondering who was that man, really, and what was he planning. One thing's for sure, I'll never look at the 4th of July quite the same way again. Living in a small rural college town often felt like the perfect mix of coziness and safety. With a strong sense of community and university police constantly patrolling, I never had a reason to feel uneasy even walking through campus late at night. That's why the 4th of July had always been one of my favorite events in town. The whole place came alive with parades, food trucks, and, of course, the grand fireworks display by the lake. This year, my boyfriend drove over from his town to spend the evening with me. We spent the day enjoying the celebrations. But as the night unfolded, things took an unexpected and unsettling turn. After grabbing ice cream from a food truck, we made our way toward the lake where everyone was gathering for the fireworks. Along the way, we decided to stop and admire some horses grazing in a small pasture. It was peaceful, and the cool breeze of the summer evening made the moment feel perfect. That's when I heard it. "Hey, you in the white hat." I turned to see a man walking toward us, calling out to my boyfriend, who was wearing his usual white baseball cap. From the moment I saw him, something felt off. The man looked disheveled, with old, dirty clothes and a guitar slung over his back. His eyes had a wild, erratic look, and his energy was unsettling. He walked up to us quickly, explaining that his friends had dropped him off for the fireworks, and he was wondering where most people would be watching the display. My boyfriend, always polite, started giving him directions to the best spot by the lake. But the man wasn't just looking for information. He lingered, asking more questions, and shifting his weight from one foot to the other as if he couldn't stand still. There was something about his energy that made me feel uneasy, but I tried to be polite, hoping he would move along, but instead he started asking more personal questions, whether we were students, how long we'd lived in the town, and where we were from. My boyfriend mentioned his favorite football team, and that seemed to set something off in the man. His eyes lit up, and he excitedly told us that he had just written a song about that very team. Before we could stop him, he was already reaching for his guitar. "There's really no need," I tried to say, but he was insistent. He launched into a bizarre 15-minute freestyle rap that was full of clunky rhymes and incoherent lyrics. My boyfriend and I exchanged uneasy glances, both trying not to laugh, but also feeling increasingly uncomfortable. As the sun began to set, more people were making their way to the lake, and I felt a growing sense of urgency to join them and escape this awkward situation. But the man wasn't budging. When he finally finished his song, I thought we'd have a chance to politely excuse ourselves and move on. But things only got stranger. The man started asking even more personal questions, and his tone shifted from friendly to something more unsettling. At one point he asked if I was my boyfriend's sister. When my boyfriend explained that we were dating, the man's eyes widened with excitement, and he began rambling about relationships and finding the one. He then claimed to be the Archangel Michael, sent to earth for a divine purpose. As if that weren't strange enough, he added that he planned to run for mayor in 2028. By this point, I was getting more nervous. The man's behavior was becoming erratic. He leaned in closer to my boyfriend and made a bizarre comment about how blue-eyed people were closer to God. My boyfriend, who'd been patient up until this point, was clearly growing uncomfortable. His hand slipped into his pocket where I knew he kept a small knife just in case. The man, meanwhile, kept stumbling around, edging closer and closer to us, while muttering under his breath. I wasn't sure if he was high, mentally unstable, or both, but his unpredictable behavior was starting to make me anxious. I thought about pretending to know one of the families walking by just to get out of the conversation, but I didn't want to provoke this guy, who seemed more unstable by the minute. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man decided to leave us alone. He mumbled something about heading to the lake and walked off, immediately approaching another group of people. My boyfriend and I exchanged relieved glances, but couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. We sat down near the lake, surrounded by other families and couples, but the encounter had left a lingering tension in the air. As the fireworks lit up the night sky, we couldn't stop talking about how strange the experience had been. Even though the man hadn't done anything overtly dangerous, his behavior was unpredictable enough to leave us both rattled. After the fireworks ended and we made our way home, I found myself replaying the entire interaction in my head, wondering what his story was. Out of curiosity, I later looked him up using the Facebook name he had given us. His profile was full of religious ramblings and incoherent posts, confirming that something wasn't quite right. But as I scrolled further back, I found older pictures of him with the family clean-cut and happy. It was heartbreaking to see how his life had clearly spiraled, whether due to drugs, mental illness, or both. Even though the man hadn't harmed us, the encounter left me shaken. It was a reminder that even in a small, safe town, you never know who you might run into or what they're going through. I just hope that wherever he is now, he finds the help he clearly needs. I live with my parents on a farm. We have a relatively large house with a nice back patio, and a while back we got a hot tub. My parents use it often, and sometimes I join them. Now that I have my own car, they become more comfortable leaving me alone at the house when they travel for a few days. I've gotten used to it, and the quiet of the countryside, though it took some adjusting since I grew up in the city. One of the biggest changes from city life was the wide open space. Back in the city, I was used to people walking by constantly. Now I can leave my curtains open, even get changed in front of the window, without worrying about someone seeing me. It's rare for anyone to pass by the farm these days. This all happened a few weeks ago when my parents left to attend a wedding for a few days. I stayed behind to take care of the animals, and everything seemed fine. We kept in touch regularly. On the second or third night, after a long day of work, I decided to relax in the hot tub around 11 p.m. It was a perfect night, and one of the things I love about living in the country is how you can see the stars so clearly without all the city lights. It's peaceful and soothing, so I settled into unwind. After about 10 minutes of soaking, though, I got an odd feeling that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't from the cool night air, but that eerie sense that someone was watching me. Startled, I looked around, and after my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the field behind our barn, where a row of saplings marks the edge of our property, I spotted what looked like a person standing between the trees. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. My heart started racing, and I stood up in the tub, trying to get a better look. They didn't budge, but I was certain that whoever it was had their eyes on me. I decided not to panic, even though every instinct in me was screaming to run. I calmly got out of the tub, closed everything up, and went inside, making sure to lock all the doors and windows. The dogs were inside, completely unaware, and I didn't want to alert them. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with yet. Part of me debated calling the police, but living in the middle of nowhere, I figured by the time they got there, the person would be long gone. Instead, I chose to keep an eye on the situation from inside. Our living room faces the backyard, so I could still see where the figure had been. It was hard to see clearly with the lights on the inside, but the person was still there, standing just as they had been before. My anxiety was through the roof. They weren't doing anything, just standing there like a statue. I considered grabbing my stepdad's rifle from the basement, but I had no idea where he kept it or how to use it, and I didn't want to leave the living room in case the figure moved. Every few minutes, I would glance out the window, and every time, they were still there. It was past midnight by now, and I was getting more uneasy by the minute. Who could this person be? Why were they standing there, doing nothing? It didn't make sense. Our neighbors are friendly, and we don't have any known enemies. With 2 cars parked in the driveway, it would have been hard to know that I was home alone. Nothing about the situation made sense. Finally, around 12:20 a.m., the figure moved. I froze, watching as they slowly turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing behind the barn. The relief was immediate, but it didn't last long. Just because I couldn't see them anymore didn't mean they were gone. They could still be lurking around the property, hiding in the trees. The feeling of being watched had gone, but I wasn't taking any chances. I decided to stay up all night just in case. As the sun rose, I eventually dozed off on the couch. When I woke up the next day, I wasn't sure if I had dreamed the whole thing, but I couldn't shake the unease. After doing my chores, I went outside to check the area where I had seen the figure. I walked the property line from one end to the other, but there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. It had been dry all week, so there were no clear markings in the dirt. For a moment I wondered if I had imagined it all, but the memory of that eerie feeling, the unmistakable sense that someone was watching me, stuck with me. I may have a tendency to overthink things, but that night felt too real to dismiss as paranoia. Whoever it was, I hope I never see them again. Nothing like that has happened since, and I pray it stays that way. I should start by saying that entering abandoned buildings is a dumb idea, but for someone who loves the thrill of adventure and the allure of the unknown, it can be hard to resist. That brings me to the story of the blue house. It was a humid summer day in the Midwest, the kind of sticky heat that begs for an adventure. My friend Greg, and I will call me Steve, were looking for one. We had heard about a wooded area in southern Michigan known as Purgatory, a notorious spot for teen parties, rumored to be one of Al Capone's hideouts. With the windows rolled down and music blaring, we made the hour-long drive, excited for what we discovered this time. We had visited Purgatory before, capturing eerie photos, and even attempting to spend the night, though that's a different story. Our original plan this time was to check out Capone's hideout in the daylight, but when we arrived, we were disappointed to see it had been trashed, vandalized to the point of looking like a junkyard. It wasn't what we had hoped for, so we decided to explore the surrounding woods instead. We walked for about 3 miles into the dense forest when we stumbled upon something we hadn't expected: a rundown blue house. The light blue siding was faded, the roof had no shingles, and a nearby shed was filled with trash and old yard tools. At this point, we were itching for a thrill, so we agreed to investigate the place. We circled the house, looking for anything out of the ordinary. The backyard was overgrown with tall grass, and oddly enough, there was no back door. Hyping each other up for the inevitable spooks, we made our way to the front. That's when we noticed the decaying state of the place. The floor had caved in, the wood was rotting, and the air was thick with the scent of mold. But what really caught our attention were the Polaroid and film photos scattered across the floor. The place was flooded with photos. Everywhere you stepped, there were images of families, children, and moments long forgotten. It was unsettling, to say the least. "This is creepy," I whispered to Greg. He nodded in agreement. Before I could say anything else, Greg leaned in and whispered, "Did you hear that?" I shrugged it off at first, thinking he was trying to scare me, but then I heard it too, a sound like someone tossing pencils onto a desk, coming from the other side of the house. "Steve, maybe we should leave." "This doesn't feel right," Greg said, his voice tense. "We just got here. It's probably just an animal or something." "Let's keep looking," I urged, my curiosity getting the best of me. Greg reluctantly tiptoed forward, careful not to step through the rotting wood. I followed, equally cautious. It felt like an eternity, but eventually we reached the hallway where the noise had come from. That's when we saw him. The man was big, not muscular, but overweight. He wore a gray shirt and dark jeans that looked too big for him around the legs, but tight around the waist. His dark brown hair was cut into a terrible bowl shape. As we approached, the man suddenly lunged at Greg. Greg jumped back, screaming, but he landed on a nail sticking out of a wooden plank. The man lunged again, pinning Greg to the ground, with the nail still embedded in his foot. I reacted without thinking, running over to throw punches and kick at the man, but he wouldn't budge. In a desperate moment, I yanked the plank out of Greg's foot and slammed it into the side of the man's face. He screamed in agony, grabbing his head. Greg managed to roll the man off and scrambled to his feet. "Run!" I shouted at Greg. He limped, sobbing as we sprinted out of the house and into the woods, not daring to look back. Running through the woods is hard on a good day, but with Greg injured, it felt impossible. I didn't look back, terrified that the man might be chasing us. We ran until we were out of breath, stopping only when we were sure we had lost him. I glanced around. There was no sign of the man. "We must have lost him," I said, panting. Greg didn't respond. He looked completely traumatized, and I felt terrible for pushing him to stay. It took us 2 hours to find our way back to the car, using the faintest signal we could find to pull up a map. Once we reached the hospital, Greg was treated for his injuries. The nail had gone deep, and the bruises on his neck told the story of how close we had come to something much worse. To this day, I don't know who the man in the blue house was or why he was there, but I do know one thing: sometimes the thrill just isn't worth the danger. My friend Robert and I had just spent the day in a city a few hours from our own. We had attended an event, and it was a blast. Afterward, we grabbed dinner with some friends and stayed out until almost midnight before deciding to head home. The drive back was uneventful for the most part. The roads between the cities are pretty rural, with only a few small towns scattered along the way. Since it was dark, we kept an eye out for animals that might dart across the road while chatting casually. As we neared Robert's house, something odd happened. We noticed a car parked on the opposite side of the road, facing the wrong way, and the men walking around near it. There was an ambulance in front of us that stopped to check on him. As we drove past, I made brief eye contact with the man, but we didn't think much of it and kept going. We drove for another 20 to 30 minutes, and eventually we turned onto the access road leading to Robert's house. A little farther up, we noticed another car had also turned onto the road behind us. Robert lives in a gated community, so we had to stop to open the gate. That's when we noticed the car behind us had also followed us through the gate before it could close. At first, we didn't think much of it, and even joked about the possibility of being followed. But as we drove deeper into the neighborhood, the car was still behind us. The route we took was a large curve, and we figured the car should have turned off by now. When it didn't, we started to get suspicious. We called Robert's dad, who'd seen us drive by with the car trailing us. As we completed the loop, it became clear that we were indeed being followed. Robert started driving faster through the neighborhood, and the car behind us sped up as well. We were going 50 to 60 miles per hour on small residential roads, and yet the other car kept pace with us. We decided to head toward the front gate, where a security guard was stationed 24/7. We didn't know if the person chasing us had a key fob to get in or not. Robert pulled a U-turn and sped back to the front gate. At this point, anyone watching could see we were being chased. When we reached the gate, Robert managed to open it in a way that made it difficult for the car to follow us. But as we turned the corner, he saw the gate open again. The car had gotten through. This is where we made a huge mistake. In our panic, we turned down a road without realizing it was a dead-end cul-de-sac. As soon as we realized, Robert flipped the car around, and we sped past the pursuing vehicle. As we passed them, I made brief eye contact with the driver, but I couldn't see his face clearly. We turned off the lights and floored it, managing to shake him and finally get to Robert's house. Once we were safe, we called the police. They arrived a little while later, and after speaking to us, the officer got a call on the radio and rushed back to his car. A few minutes later, Two more police cars showed up, and we learned that they had found the car. The man driving was the same guy we had passed on the side of the road earlier. When the police approached him, he refused to speak and didn't seem to be in a right state of mind. Eventually, he became aggressive, even threatening the officers. It turned out the man was a mentally ill veteran from a couple of states away and had no reason to be anywhere near our area. He had damaged the back gate when he followed us in, and, to top it off, the guard at the front gate, whose sole job was to ensure that people without a key fob wouldn't enter, had let this guy in without question. The guard was promptly fired by the security company after that incident. Looking back, there's only one thing I would have done differently. I would have called the police sooner. But in the heat of the moment, with the adrenaline pumping, our judgment was clouded and we didn't think clearly. We were lucky nothing worse happened, but it's a night neither of us will ever forget. Back in college, between 2008 and 2014, I had a hobby that not many of my friends shared: metal detecting. It was a strange interest for a college student, but I loved the thrill of discovery. I had my eye on an old military trail and a river crossing deep in a secluded portion of the woods near San Angelo, Texas. It wasn't a spot many people knew about, and I figured I'd finally give it a try one chilly winter morning. I parked my truck at a city park along the South Conco River, grabbed my gear including a serrated knife for digging, and headed into the thick woods. The area was pretty raw and untouched, the perfect spot for someone like me hoping to find old relics buried in the dirt. As I made my way about a mile or two in, I stumbled upon a small clearing near the riverbank. There, tucked away, was a tent. It wasn't your average, neatly kept campsite. There were empty cans strewn all around, discarded clothing, and other random items that made it clear someone had been living there, not just camping for fun. I wasn't about to linger too long, so I just gave it a quick glance and kept walking, minding my own business. That's when he appeared, a man looking rough and haggard. He emerged from the brush only a few feet from me. He had clearly been living in the woods, and the surprise was mutual. We both startled each other. After a brief moment of awkwardness, we started chatting. He asked me what I was doing out there, and I explained my metal detecting hobby, mentioning the old military trail I was hoping to explore. To make things seem less suspicious, I lied and said it was a well-known spot for hobbyists, thinking it would ease the situation, but it didn't. Instead, my words seemed to make him anxious. He started asking if I'd been near his campsite, or, more specifically, if I had messed with his tent. I hadn't, of course. I told him I'd only accidentally stepped on one of the cans, but hadn't gone near his stuff. He seemed mostly concerned about whether I had looked into the tent. I assured him I hadn't. The guy went on to tell me that his wife had kicked him out of their apartment a few days earlier, and that's why he was living in the woods for the time being. Something about the story didn't sit right with me, but I wasn't about to question it. I just nodded along, keeping the conversation as light as possible. Eventually, I told him I needed to be on my way. That's when he gave me a strange look and suggested that I not go behind his campsite because, as he put it, he had just used the bathroom there. Whether that was true or not, I had no intention of sticking around any longer. I continued on, but a creeping unease settled over me. The whole encounter had been off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to focus on my original goal of metal detecting, but after only a short while, I decided I didn't want to be in those woods anymore. Instead of heading toward the old trail, I turned toward the river and quickly made my way back to my truck. I didn't see the man again that day, and I pushed the encounter to the back of my mind. It wasn't until 2 years later that everything came rushing back. His face was on the local news, arrested for the murder of his wife. According to the reports, he had killed her and buried her in those very woods, in the same area where I had met him that winter morning. The timeline matched up, though I couldn't recall the exact day I'd crossed paths with him. It was likely that I had encountered him just after he had committed the crime. The realization sent chills down my spine. That weird look, his concern about whether I had looked in the tent, it all made sense now. I had unknowingly walked right into the aftermath of something horrific, and I had gotten out just in time. School in the city. Even though I lived in the suburbs, English isn't my first language, so I apologize if I make any grammatical mistakes. One day after school, instead of waiting at the nearest bus stop, I decided to walk to the main bus station. I stood at the gate where my bus line, number 15, starts. Another bus, number 17, also departs from the same gate. After waiting about 10 minutes, a man approached me and asked if the number 17 bus had already left. I told him it had, and he'd just missed it. He introduced himself as Mark and extended his hand for a handshake. I didn't want to seem rude, so I shook his hand and told him my name was Maya. Of course, my name isn't Maya. I found it strange that a grown man would introduce himself to me at a bus station, but I wasn't completely alarmed yet. He started asking me questions. He asked if I had just finished school, and I said yes. He asked which school I attended, and I lied, giving him a fake name. He asked if I was going home, and I said no, even though I was. He asked where I was going, and I lied again, saying I was headed to a friend's house. My bus pulled up, and I got on. To my surprise, Mark got on as well. I knew he had asked about the number 17 bus earlier, so it didn't make sense for him to be on bus 15. They didn't share any stops. I sat down, and he sat next to me. He asked me what year of high school I was in, and I lied again, saying I was a junior. In reality, I was a freshman. He remarked that I looked too young to be a junior, and I brushed it off, saying I get that a lot. Then he asked if I had a boyfriend, and when I said no, he told me I should. Trying to turn the conversation away from myself, I asked where he was headed. He said he was going home, and that he lived at the very end of the bus line. That struck me as odd, since I had never seen him on this bus before. He asked if I was going home, and I repeated my lie about visiting a friend. He nodded but seemed suspicious. Looking back, I realized he probably knew I was lying, but at the time I felt like I had control of the situation. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I didn't tell the bus driver or anyone else what was going on. I thought Mark was just some lonely, strange guy and didn't feel scared enough to take action. When my stop came, I purposefully didn't get off and waited until the next stop, hoping to throw him off. But when I got off the bus, he did too. I asked where he was going, and he said he wanted to walk me home. I repeated that I wasn't going home, but to a friend's house. In a stern voice, he told me to shut up and walk. Suddenly, the situation turned serious. I realized I had messed up. There was no one else around, and we were alone on the street. I was terrified. I couldn't go home because I didn't want him knowing where I lived. I froze, unsure of what to do. Mark placed his hand on my shoulder and told me that he didn't have much time, so we should get going. He added that if I behaved, I didn't need to be afraid. I lied again and said I wasn't scared. He made me repeat that I would be good. I started walking, with him still holding my shoulder. My heart was pounding so fast I thought I was going to collapse. I had no idea where I was headed, but I just kept moving. Then I spotted an older man tending to his garden in front of his house. That's the last clear memory I have of the event. I later learned that I screamed for help and ran toward the older man, while Mark ran off. The man called the police, and they contacted my parents. The police took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do, since my parents couldn't always pick me up from school. They bought me a cell phone, a big deal back in the 90s, when mobile phones were still a luxury. Unfortunately, this wasn't the end of the story. A few weeks later, I got on the bus after school, just like I always did. As soon as I stepped on, I saw him. Mark was sitting there, grinning at me like he was thrilled to see me again. I immediately got off the bus and ran back into my school. I called my mom in tears, and she told me to find a teacher to wait with me until she arrived. After that, the school was notified of the situation. Mark was spotted several times near my school in the following weeks. Sometimes he'd show up multiple days in a row, and other times he wouldn't be seen for weeks. The police couldn't do anything because he hadn't physically harmed me or trespassed on school property. I spent the rest of the school year waiting inside until my mom could pick me up, and we took long, winding routes home to make sure we weren't being followed. My parents eventually had me transfer schools. Thankfully, Mark was never seen near my neighborhood, and I'm sure he never learned my real name or address. I only saw him once more. I was 21 and home on summer break from university. I saw him at a grocery store in a different part of town. He didn't recognize me, didn't even look my way, but I recognized him immediately. Where I live, we don't have public records like a convicted criminal list, so I never learned his full name. I don't know what his intentions were or what he had done in the past. My mom believed he had more sinister plans, but I think he was just mentally unstable and fixated on me for some reason. Either way, I'm glad he's out of my life. I recently got a job at Walmart in the online grocery department. Even though I do not interact with customers as much as cashiers or customer service, I still answer many questions and help people find items. While I have encountered some rude and clueless people, I had not experienced many creepy men at Walmart. My previous jobs involved men making inappropriate comments about my body and body modifications, but at Walmart, there always seemed to be someone stranger around, so the creepy encounters were fewer. It all started around noon when I went out for my first pick run of the day. I was in the soda aisle, struggling to fit a box of beer into my cart when a guy approached and helped me. He looked to be in his early to mid-20s, a bit shorter than me, and was wearing a corn shirt. I thanked him for the help and complimented his shirt. He responded politely and complimented my hair in return. It seemed like a normal interaction. I went back to my work, bagging soda and hoping I wouldn't be sent on any difficult runs that night. About 15 minutes later, I was in the soup aisle, crouched on the floor bagging cans of Dinty Moore. A person walked up behind me and said, "Excuse me." I was surprised, since nobody usually says "excuse me" when they need my attention. I stood up and turned around to see the same guy from earlier. He claimed he had been searching for baking soda and wanted to make sure he was looking in the right place. Conveniently, the baking aisle was a few aisles over, and I needed bread flour for my run. I told him I was heading to that island, offered to show him where the baking soda was. He thanked me, and we headed over. The store was unusually empty since it was a Tuesday. When we reached the baking aisle, I showed him the baking soda and then started picking out bread flour. I noticed that he placed a tiny box of Arm & Hammer baking soda into his cart and just stood there on his phone, occasionally glancing at me. It was odd, but maybe he was just feeling awkward. After finishing my pick run, I staged the totes onto the cart and took them to the back. I went on to more runs before my first 15-minute break. During the break, I thought I saw the corn guy walk past the break room door, but I dismissed it as another employee wearing a similar shirt. Later, my manager instructed me to complete 3 more pick runs before starting to dispense orders. I was assigned a produce run, which is always chaotic and confusing. While I was working in the produce section, I saw the corn guy standing by the corn stand. It was now 1:30 p.m., and he had been at Walmart for at least an hour and a half with only 3 items in his cart. I was getting seriously uncomfortable. He approached me and greeted me. I asked if he needed any help, and he launched into the creepiest rant I have ever heard. He told me that I did not need to eat salad if I did not want to, and that I did not need to lose weight. He implied that if I was trying to impress someone, I should find someone who would love me for who I am rather than wanting to change me. He finished by calling me beautiful. I was stunned and horrified. For one, I eat salads because I enjoy them, not to impress anyone. Secondly, I have a boyfriend who could not care less about my eating habits. Lastly, I was deeply offended that this stranger felt he had the right to comment on my personal choices and validate me. I told him his comments were inappropriate, and he should stay out of employee-only areas like the break room. I directed him to customer service if he needed further assistance, and left to speak with the manager. I explained the situation to my manager, who understood and allowed me to start dispensing early, while sending someone else to complete my pick runs. The rest of the day went smoothly, except when my co-worker and I went out to deliver a large order to the main parking lot. I saw Corn Guy sitting on a bench out front. I hoped he was waiting for a ride and avoided taking any more orders to the main lot. I managed to finish putting away returns without encountering him, and at 8 p.m., went back to the online grocery department to clock out. As I was walking to my old CRV, which was parked in front of the grocery section, I saw Corn Guy approaching me. It was starting to get dark, and the weather had been rainy and cool all day. I was nervous about what he might want, but I had my keys out with pepper spray attached. Hoping he would not be foolish enough to try anything, he approached and started talking to me. I shut him down immediately, telling him he had been following me all day, and I was uncomfortable. I told him that if he needed anything related to Walmart, he should speak to customer service, and if he wanted to talk to me personally, I was not interested and he needed to leave me alone. He looked offended and said something even more bizarre. He claimed he would not ask me out because I was being ungrateful and called me a bitch. He thought I was cool because of my stretched ears and appreciation for Korn's music, but accused me of being just like every other girl. At this point, he pulled out a tiny switchblade from his pocket. It was a pathetic little knife, barely functional. I was even more offended. First, he had been stalking me all day because of my stretched ears and a compliment about his band shirt. Second, he thought Korn was a unique band that no one else knew about. Third, he was threatening me with a knife that was laughable at best. I was fed up with this creep, so I got into my car, told him to leave me alone, slammed the door, and drove away. I have not seen him since. But I work almost every day, so it is only a matter of time before I encounter him again. To the creepy guy in the corn shirt who pulled a knife on me in the Walmart parking lot, I hope we never meet again. This feels like something straight out of a no-sleep story, and it's still hard for me to wrap my head around. I've been meaning to share it for a while, but I've been caught up dealing with a family tragedy these past few months. Things are finally starting to settle into a new normal, so now seems like a good time. Apologies in advance for any formatting issues. I'm typing this on my phone, and it's a bit of a long one. Let me start by describing the nightmare I had as a kid. It's a vivid memory, mostly because of how terrifying it was. I was about 4 or 5 years old, maybe 6 at most. My twin brother and I shared a bunk bed in the room at the far end of the house where we grew up. In the dream, I was lying in bed, looking out the window. The sky was red, like it gets just before dawn, when the sun is about to rise but isn't there yet. The only other thing I remember is seeing a man with piercing blue eyes and a bald head staring at me through the window. That's when I woke up, screaming my head off. I don't remember where my brother was when I woke up, but I do remember my mom coming to get me and calming me down as she took me to her room. That part is clear because I remember wondering where my dad was at the time. Fast forward to this May. My dad had been hospitalized in Colombia, where he lived, and my twin brother, older sister, and I were staying in a hotel about 5 minutes from the hospital where he was in the ICU. After a long day of supporting Dad and the extended family, we returned to the hotel one evening, trying to unwind with a couple of beers. As we talked, the topic of nightmares came up, and I shared the story about the creepy man in my childhood dream. Without skipping a beat, my sister told me that it wasn't just a nightmare, it actually happened. She remembers the whole thing. My sister, who is 5 years older than my brother and me, would have been around 9 or 10 at the time. Her bedroom was next to ours, but it faced the front lawn and the street, while ours faced the neighbor's house. There was only a small fence separating the two properties. She told me that for days leading up to the event, a bald man in a truck had been following her as she rode her bike home from school with friends. He passed our house a couple of times, and on the day before the nightmare, he drove by again. At the time, my sister was what people use to call a latchkey kid. My brother and I went to a special school about 45 minutes away for speech therapy, a common thing for twins. So my mom had to pick us up, leaving my sister home alone for an hour or so after school. That day had been normal as far as she recalls. Dad came home from his job. He worked part-time as a cop and also at a hardware store, and we had dinner together, played, and did the usual family stuff before heading to bed. But then, sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., things got terrifying. The same bald man from the truck parked his vehicle down the street near a small industrial park and walked to our house. He tried to break in through my sister's window, waking her up. She screamed when she saw him, nearly getting the window open. It wasn't locked. My dad rushed into her room, and while she doesn't remember exactly what happened next, she recalls him either shoving the guy out or trying to hit him with his nightstick. The man fled, but only for a moment. Not long after, he came around to the window of my room where my brother and I were sleeping. This time, he couldn't get in because my mom always kept our window locked. Our bunk bed was right up against it, and she didn't want us messing with it. I remember screaming, and my sister said my mom rushed into our room to get us, while my dad ran out the front door, trying to chase the guy down. The men took off through our backyard, which backed up against a small rail yard, and the industrial park. The area was surrounded by thick, dark woods, and my dad didn't want to risk following him there. Instead, he went back inside and called the police, then checked on our elderly neighbor to make sure they were safe. Meanwhile, my mom comforted us kids. That's about all my sister remembers from that night, and I don't have many memories beyond the nightmare either. Unfortunately, my dad passed away recently, so we can't ask him for any more details. We haven't asked my mom about it yet, but I'm considering bringing it up when the time feels right. So, to the bald-headed creep who terrorized my family and me all those years ago, wherever you are, let's not meet again. A childhood nightmare of a man trying to break into my room turned out to be real. The man first tried to enter through my sister's window before attempting to get into mine. My dad scared him off, and the guy ran through our backyard into the woods. Just 2 days ago, I attended the wedding of my friend Courtney, and I still can't shake off the unsettling feeling of what happened. For a bit of context, I grew up in a very religious household, attending church every Sunday. Courtney is one of the few people from my old church that I still keep in touch with, even though my beliefs have changed. Everything started to go wrong at the reception. When I arrived, Courtney was thrilled to see me, which felt nice, especially since most of the other people from my old church seemed to be giving me cold stares. I sat down at my table, minding my own business and playing something on my phone, when a guy sat down next to me. He introduced himself as Anthony, a friend of the groom, and said the seating chart had placed him at my table. He was pretty cute, and we ended up talking for a while, really hitting it off. Unlike most people from my past, he didn't seem to judge me for being an atheist. In fact, he seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. When the dancing started and Brown-Eyed Girl came on, Anthony asked me to dance. We danced together for most of the evening, and it was honestly fun. Later, he excused himself to go to the bathroom, and after a while, I decided to go as well. When I returned, I noticed that my purse wasn't on the table anymore. It was weird because I was sure I'd left it there, but I brushed it off, thinking I must have left it in my car, so I went to the parking lot to check. When I got to my car, I found my purse sitting on the center console. This struck me as odd since I was pretty sure I'd brought it inside, but by that point it was late and I was tired, so I didn't overthink it. I went back inside, danced a little more, but noticed Anthony was gone. When I asked the groom, he told me Anthony had left early because he wasn't feeling well. Shortly after, I started feeling a bit off myself, so I decided it was time to leave. I said goodbye to Courtney and headed back to my car. As I put the key in the ignition, I glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed something move in the back. It looked like someone ducked down. My heart raced, and I quickly turned to check. That's when I saw him. Anthony was crouched down in the trunk of my car. I screamed and bolted from the car. He chased after me, but I managed to get inside the venue. Shaking, I found Courtney and told her what happened. She immediately got her husband, who walked me back to the car. By the time we got there, Anthony was gone. Courtney's husband checked the lot, but Anthony's car was missing too, so we assumed he had fled. I went home at night, but I've felt sick to my stomach ever since. The thought of what could have happened if I hadn't checked the back seat haunts me. Anthony could have followed me home or done something far worse. Courtney feels awful for inviting him, saying she had no idea he would pull something like that. The last few days have been overwhelming, but I wanted to share what's been happening since the wedding. I took some of the advice I've been given and looked into things more. Unfortunately, Anthony managed to take photos of my ID, which had my home address on it. I also found out that Anthony wasn't exactly close friends with the groom, but they knew each other well enough for him to be invited to the wedding. After the incident, the groom tried reaching out to Anthony, but he didn't get a response. To make matters worse, Anthony showed up at my job. He was seen lurking around the parking lot, but when security approached, he ran off. He even left a creepy note on my windshield that said, "I'm watching. Security at my workplace has been notified about him, and I hope that means I'm safe there." People who were at the wedding later told me that Anthony had been going around introducing himself as my boyfriend and had even mentioned something about planning to propose. The whole situation has me horrified. Right now, I'm in the process of filing a restraining order against him. Since he lives in the same city as me and knows where I live, I've decided to stay with my aunt for the time being. If anything else happens, I'll update again. But for now, I just want this nightmare to end. Hello everyone. I've been thinking about posting on Reddit for a while since I have been following her for a long time, but I never had anything interesting to share until now. Here is some background. I am a 17-year-old male, but I do not look my age at all. I have been mistaken for someone in their late 20s. One day, my friends and I were bored, so we decided to go to Far Rockaway Beach in New York. It was getting dark, but that is not really important to the story. We planned to return around 3 or 4 a.m. another day to catch the sunrise and enjoy the cool morning air by the water. Now, on to the real story. I decided to pull an all-nighter because I had just started talking to a girl, and it seemed like a good excuse to ask her to stay on the phone with me for a long time. I needed to leave around 3 a.m. to reach the beach early enough to see the sunrise. Before I left my house, I had a feeling that something bad was going to happen. As I was skating through a park next to my house to catch the bus, I saw a man from a distance. He started walking towards me slowly and eventually asked me to stop. Despite it being 3 a.m., I decided to be polite and stopped. He spoke with an accent and said strange things I could not fully understand. What I did grasp was his constant praise and his odd request to massage me, even though his behavior was strange. I live in New York, and it did not immediately make me think he was dangerous. What unsettled me was that he kept inching closer to me. When I finally decided to walk away, I felt like he was watching me intently. I turned around out of fear and saw that he was walking backward, keeping eye contact with the back of my head. Terrified, I ran as fast as I could and skated down a different hill to get as far away as possible. Unfortunately, the whole ordeal happened while I was on the phone with the girl I was talking to, so she heard the man's unsettling attempts to approach me. Whatever that man wanted, whatever his intentions were, I hope I never encounter him again. A few weeks ago, I shared my story about fleeing my home state to escape my violent stalker ex. Since moving to a different state, I've been fortunate enough not to have any direct encounters with him. However, my family back home has become his new target, and it's been a terrifying situation for all of us. Since I left, he has been stalking my mother. He's followed her to various stores while she's out shopping, clearly trying to intimidate her. One of the more alarming incidents happened when he broke into my old car, which I had left at my mom's house when I fled. He smashed the window and took the insurance and registration from the glove compartment. We have security footage of the break-in, yet he hasn't been arrested. It's frustrating and frightening that he's still free to do these things. That's not the only trouble he's caused. My mom has been dealing with random flat tires more than once. She's found nails lodged in her tires. It's too much of a coincidence, especially since my boyfriend also got a flat tire after visiting his grandparents. We don't know for sure if it's related, but it's hard not to suspect him at this point. On top of all that, 3 credit accounts were recently opened under my name, and my ex is the only person who knows my social security number. To make matters worse, he tried to anonymously send my sister flowers and Starbucks at work, but the front desk described the man who dropped them off, and we knew immediately it was him, even though I have a restraining order against him. My family does not. And unfortunately, it seems like he's focused on them now that I'm out of his reach. I'm doing everything I can to stay hidden. No one, not even my family, knows exactly where I'm living. Thankfully, the state I'm in has strong protections for domestic violence survivors and keeps our identities confidential, which gives me some peace of mind. I'm hoping he doesn't figure out my new address, but I still worry about my family every day. If you want more details about my story, you can find it on this thread and through my account. For now, I just want him to be held accountable before something worse happens. We have been dealing with kids and teens invading our private porch and patio for some time. 2 of them had been particularly troublesome, leaving trash and even leaning on our door. One looked inside. We asked them to leave, reported the incident, and thought that was the end of it. A few days later, I heard a lot of noise outside. When I opened the blinds, I was shocked to see a boy standing on our patio very close to the door. A man was asking him to move, but the boy refused. Eventually they left, but it left me feeling uneasy. Later, the same boy came back with a woman standing in a common area, recording our house. I asked what they were doing, and things quickly escalated. More people, including the man from earlier, joined them, and they started harassing us. One woman even charged at me when I asked why the boy had been on our patio. I began recording to protect myself as they kept stepping onto our patio and acting aggressively. During the chaos, the boy came back with another woman, and their dog ran into our house, trying to attack my family. I had to scream before they finally removed it. At this point, we called the cops. It didn't stop there. One of the men returned, recorded us without permission, and verbally abused me multiple times. Despite me asking them to leave, they continued harassing us, with the same woman recording me from right in front of our house. After the incident, we realized how creepy and invasive the situation had been. We also found out that 2 of the people, including the aggressive man and the woman filming, didn't even live in our community. Their behavior violated our privacy, and they even spread lies about us afterward. We reported everything to the cops and property management. Additionally, after the first incident, someone knocked on our door at midnight, which turned out to be the same teens. The property management told us to call the cops if it happened again, which is why we didn't hesitate to do so when the dog ran into our home. In 2011, I was a college student attending a university in rural Michigan. Our campus was surrounded by endless stretches of farmland, and if you venture even a short distance off campus, you were essentially in the middle of nowhere. To help pay for school, I worked at a tanning salon for all 4 years that I attended university. The salon was located in a rather remote area, far from the bustling town center, and shifts were often spent in solitude. Morning and night shifts were particularly quiet, as we worked alone, but the afternoons were a bit more lively, with 2 employees on duty at a time. Most of the employees were young women like myself, petite and between the ages of 20 and 23. It wasn't exactly a job where we encountered much trouble, given that the majority of our clientele were female college students looking to get a tan. But that changed one afternoon when something deeply unsettling happened. I was working with a coworker that afternoon when a man walked into the salon. He appeared to be in his early to mid-30s, and immediately something about him set off alarms in my mind. It wasn't just his age, which was unusual for our typical customer base. It was his overall appearance and vibe. He didn't fit the typical profile of someone coming to a tanning salon. He was pale, for one, and the majority of our customers were either already tan or actively working on getting a tan. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. There was something else, something intangible about him that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't that he looked particularly creepy, but his presence felt ... as he approached the counter. He tried hard to come off as friendly, almost overly so, and his attempts at charm felt invasive. He started asking me a lot of personal questions about my life, my work schedule, where I lived, questions that felt way too personal for a casual conversation with a customer. I answered him politely, but something about the entire interaction left me feeling uncomfortable. What stood out even more was that he never signed up for any tanning package, which meant I didn't get his name. He left without making any purchases, and though I found the whole encounter strange, I chalked it up to him just being awkward. After all, maybe he was just a socially inept guy who didn't know how to hold a conversation. That night, however, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. Out the very next morning, I had the opening shift. It was a weekend morning, and as anyone who's worked early shifts in quiet, rural areas knows, it can feel like you're the only person awake in the world. The streets were eerily silent as I drove to the salon, and once I arrived, I followed my usual routine, unlocking the front door, turning on the lights, and making sure everything was set for the day. For some reason, maybe just paranoia, I always kept the doors locked until the first customer arrived. I didn't like the idea of someone wandering in before I was ready, especially when I was opening the salon alone. A little while into my shift, I saw a car speeding into the parking lot. It pulled up to the front of the salon in a rush, and when the driver's door swung open, my heart dropped. It was the same man from the day before. He left his car door wide open and walked straight toward the front door of the salon. I was standing right in the middle of the hallway in clear view, and we made direct eye contact. He tried to open the door, but when he realized it was locked, something strange happened. His entire demeanor changed. His face fell into an expression of defeat, almost like he was disappointed. He slumped his head and quickly turned around, walking back to his car. He drove off without saying a word. I was left standing there, my heart racing. The whole situation felt off. Why had he come back so early in the morning? And why did he leave so quickly once he realized the door was locked? My gut told me this wasn't normal, and as a precaution, I wrote down the make and model of his car, along with his license plate number, just in case something else happened. After that day, I never saw him again. Years passed, and I moved on from that strange encounter, although it still occasionally crossed my mind. Then, in 2020, I started getting into true crime podcasts. One day, while listening to an episode about a notorious serial killer named Israel Keyes, I decided to look him up. The moment I saw his picture, my entire body went cold. Staring back at me was the man from the tanning salon. Keyes was known for being a transient killer who targeted isolated locations, and I discovered that his mother lived just 3 hours from my university. He was known to visit her frequently during that time. The realization hit me hard. There was a very real chance that I had come face to face with a dangerous man, someone who could have taken my life that morning. The more I thought about it, the more everything made sense. I was the perfect target for someone like him, alone, young, in an isolated area with no one around to help. The other employees were all similar in profile, which made me wonder if he had been scouting the salon to find the right moment to strike. Looking back, I often wonder what could have happened that morning if I hadn't kept the doors locked. He saw me standing there. We didn't break eye contact, and yet, when the door didn't open, he left without trying to communicate or wave like a normal customer might. Something about that brief interaction convinced me that his intentions were far more sinister than just wanting a tanning session. I am incredibly grateful that I listened to my instincts and kept the doors locked that morning. I was lucky, incredibly lucky, that I never had to find out what his true plans were. The experience serves as a constant reminder of how important it is to trust your gut, even when things seem harmless on the surface. When I was around 15 years old, something unsettling happened that stayed with me to this day. I was hanging out with two of my friends in our neighborhood which, while known for some trouble, had always felt relatively safe for us. Our small town was tight-knit, and everyone seemed to know everyone else, so nighttime walks were a common pastime. One evening, we decided to chill on a bench by the local kindergarten. The place was usually peaceful, and we enjoyed just talking and relaxing. But that night, things took a strange turn. Out of nowhere, a man we had never seen before pulled up in a car and got out. From the moment we spotted him, there was something off about him. He had a menacing presence, and the way he approached us made us uneasy. What happened next is something I still struggle to understand. He stared at us with an unsettling intensity, then, without saying a word, began to load a gun right in front of us. The metallic click of the gun being loaded was like a jolt of ice through our veins. We were frozen in shock and fear, unsure of what to do. The man's actions seemed deliberate, and it was clear he wanted us to see what he was doing. Panic set in. Without a moment's hesitation, we jumped over a nearby fence and ran as fast as we could, hearts pounding. We didn't stop until we were far away, hiding in the shadows and trying to catch our breath. When we finally looked back, the man was just standing there, watching us from a distance before eventually walking back to his car and driving off. The whole encounter was baffling and terrifying. In our country, gun laws are extremely strict, so the fact that someone would openly display and handle a gun was already shocking. The man's behavior was even more confusing. Was he genuinely threatening us, or was he simply trying to scare us off? Was it a mind game, or was he testing our reactions? We never found out. The whole incident left us rattled, and, despite our initial fear, we couldn't help but speculate about the man's motives. Was he just trying to intimidate us, or was there something more sinister behind his actions? It all began last September, but I am only now finding the courage to share this story. Recent events have pushed me to revisit it as the unnerving incidents continue. Apologies in advance if I ramble. I am writing this while feeling the effects of an edible, so bear with me. For some context, I live in an apartment complex situated right next to a golf course and country club on the outskirts of town. It's quiet here, especially at night, with only a few residents in the area. My building sits on a small hill at the end of a road, and my apartment is tucked into the back corner on the ground floor. This setup means that the bottoms of my windows are just a few inches off the ground, giving anyone walking by a perfect view inside. There's also a trail running behind the building through a small patch of woods, adding to the eerie feeling I sometimes get when I am home alone. At my living room window faces a small patch of grass before a tree line separates my apartment from the houses on the next street. One of these houses became important to the story when a family moved in last summer. I've only ever seen a middle-aged man and his dog, but his presence would later become a source of discomfort. The first time I noticed something strange was when I took my Shih Tzu, Holly, outside for a bathroom break. As we walked past the dumpster shed, I noticed the man in his backyard, standing in a way that struck me as odd. His arms were crossed, and he was swaying slightly, like an NPC in an old video game waiting for interaction. He didn't have his dog with him, which was strange, given that our dogs were the same breed. We made brief eye contact, and I awkwardly waved before quickly looking away, pretending to be occupied with my phone. But even from my peripheral vision, I could tell he was still staring at us. My younger brother lives on the second floor of the same complex, and he'd occasionally mentioned seeing that man walking his dog around. However, something unusual caught his attention. Instead of sticking to his backyard, the man would cross the tree line and slowly circle our building, often getting uncomfortably close. It was unsettling, but at the time, we dismissed it as harmless curiosity. Then, last September, my boyfriend and I broke up. The night I told him to leave, I went to a friend's house to clear my head. I didn't want to leave Holly alone for too long, so after about an hour, I returned home, exhausted from the emotional toll of the breakup. I fell asleep on the couch, with a YouTube rain sound video playing in the background. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to Holly barking and growling like crazy. She had climbed onto the other couch, which was right under the living room window, and was fixated on something outside. At first, I thought it was nothing, maybe an animal or someone walking by, but then I realized something that made my stomach drop. The curtains were thin enough that I could usually see the street lights from the next road over shining faintly through them. But now there was a dark shape blocking the light right where Holly was barking. I grabbed the remote and turned off the TV, hoping to get a better look. As the screen faded to black, with that retro-style animation where the picture collapses inward, the brief flash of light illuminated the room for just a second. And in that second, I saw someone crouch outside my window, dressed in dark clothing, staring into my apartment. The instant the light faded, the figure bolted, disappearing into the darkness. My heart raced as I picked up Holly, ran to the kitchen, and grabbed a knife. I rushed to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. Panicked, I texted my ex, asking if he had been outside the window. His reply came quickly. He swore he wasn't, and even sent me his live location, proving he was over an hour away at a friend's house. He urged me to call the police, which I did. When the officers arrived, they searched the area but found no one. One of them told me they'd patrol the area for a while, just in case. Over the next couple of weeks, Holly's late-night barking continued, always around 2 or 3 a.m. I never managed to catch sight of anyone again, but the sense of dread lingered. Fast forward to May 2024, just last week. I had gone through some old storage boxes and found a few of my ex's things. While I was out with friends, he came by to pick them up. Later that evening, he sent me a text asking me to come home because there was something important we needed to discuss. When I got back, I could see the confusion on his face. He explained that while he was loading his truck, he took Holly out for a quick walk. As he was standing near the dumpster at the edge of the parking lot, an older lady from the second floor approached him. She seemed shaken. She told him that as she was taking her trash out, she heard a twig snap in the direction of my apartment. When she turned to look, she saw a man standing outside my living room window. But this wasn't just someone walking by or glancing in. He was pressed up against the glass, one hand shielding the light, while the other held a phone, pointing into my apartment. She yelled at him, demanding to know what he was doing. Instead of running, he casually walked away, ignoring her completely. He didn't rush or show any sign of panic, just strolled off like nothing had happened. When my ex relayed this to me, I felt a wave of terror wash over me. The thought of someone peering into my home, invading my privacy like that, made my skin crawl. Why was this happening again? That night, I immediately ordered a Ring camera and other security measures for my apartment, something I should have done long ago. The thought of someone spying on me, especially in the dead of night, is a fear I never expected to live with. I don't know who this man is or what he wants, but I'm not taking any chances anymore. I'll update if anything else happens. But for now, I'm just trying to stay vigilant and hope that this unnerving chapter in my life comes to an end. After reading so many stories in this subreddit, I was reminded of an experience I had many years ago, one that I thought I had pushed deep down, but clearly it still lingers. I'm originally from South America, but I've been living in the United States for about 11 years now. When I was 21, I moved to a small mountain town in Colorado called Silverthorne. This was back when I was part of an exchange program for college students, which allowed me to work and travel during the summer break. I had never seen snow before in my life, so when I was offered the chance to live and work in a cold, snowy place, I couldn't contain my excitement. I had been hired to work at a popular hotel in the nearby town of Frisco, which wasn't far from the hostel where I was staying with other exchange students. The hostel itself had some creepy vibes and its own unsettling stories, but those are for another time. My focus back then was my new job, and I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. When I first arrived at the hotel for my job, I met the owner, a Ukrainian-American man in his mid-40s. He was a tall guy with thick, dark eyebrows and an intense stare. He introduced himself and asked me a few questions in a way that felt more like an interrogation than an interview. At the time, my English wasn't great, and I was still learning, so I did my best to communicate. After what felt like an uncomfortable eternity of him staring at me, he finally said I would be working as a hostess in the hotel's restaurant. He also mentioned I'd be delivering room service orders. I was surprised because I thought I'd be doing back-of-house work or housekeeping, but he insisted that this role would suit me. The job itself was challenging. For those who know the area, it's very close to Vail, a major ski resort, so the town gets extremely busy during the ski season. Guests came from all over the world, and there I was, struggling with my English while trying to manage a crowded restaurant. Eventually, I started helping out with breakfast service, which was even more hectic. Sometimes I would mess up orders, and that's when I first saw the owner's dark side. He had a temper and he wasn't shy about showing it. Once, a co-worker of mine, who was also an exchange student, was taking a bit longer than usual to wipe down a table. There were guests waiting to be seated, and I guess the owner lost his patience. He stormed over, yanked the towel out of her hand, and yelled at both of us for being slow and useless. Then he threw the towel in her face, which left us both stunned. My co-worker had been living in the States for years and had excellent English skills, but that didn't seem to matter to him. He treated us both like we were inferior, always making it clear that he thought we weren't good enough. Despite the way he acted during work hours, the owner had a different attitude at night. After the restaurant had closed and things had calmed down, he would act apologetic, almost like he was trying to make up for the way he treated us earlier. He'd offer to buy us drinks at the bar and make comments about how beautiful I was. I remember one night in particular when he caressed my leg while we were sitting at the bar. His behavior was crossing lines, and I started to feel really uncomfortable around him. I made an effort to avoid being alone with him whenever I could. One of the scariest moments of that winter came on New Year's Eve. I was out with some co-workers celebrating when I received some shocking news about an incident at the hostel where I lived. One of the residents, a guy who had clearly taken too many drugs, had a breakdown. He chased another exchange student from South America around the hostel, pointing a gun at him while screaming racist slurs and death threats. Thankfully, the police were called and the guy was arrested, but after that, none of us felt safe at the hostel anymore. The next day, I was at work talking to a co-worker about the incident when the owner overheard us. He immediately came over and asked if I was okay. I thought it was considerate of him to check in, but then he did something unexpected. He offered me a room at the hotel, free of charge, for 2 weeks while I looked for another place to live. I hesitated at first, but since the hostel didn't feel safe, I accepted the offer. For the first few days, staying at the hotel felt like a blessing. I finally had privacy, which was a luxury after sharing a room with 5 other girls at the hostel. I could sleep in a bit longer before my breakfast shift since I was already at work, and I didn't have to worry about creepy incidents happening at the hostel. But my relief was short-lived. About a week into my stay at the hotel, I had one of the busiest days at work. The restaurant had been slammed all day with customers, and I had been delivering room service orders non-stop. By the time I got back to my room, I was exhausted. I quickly fell asleep, hoping to sleep in the next morning since I had the day off. Around 2 a.m., I woke up feeling groggy, my head still heavy with sleep. Something didn't feel right. As I rubbed my eyes and tried to wake myself up, I noticed that the door to my hotel room was slightly ajar. The hallway light spilled into the room, casting shadows across the floor. That's when I saw a tall figure standing in my room, watching me sleep. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was a man. That's when I realized what was about to happen. I screamed at the top of my lungs. The figure quickly turned and ran out of the room, disappearing into the hallway. I was left sitting in my bed, shaking and terrified. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I went to the front desk and asked management if someone had entered my room. They shrugged it off, saying it was probably a mistake. Maybe housekeeping had accidentally gone into the wrong room. But it didn't make sense. Housekeeping at 2 a.m. And why would they be standing in my room, staring at me? The owner, however, didn't say a word about the incident. In fact, he started to avoid me altogether, which was a relief in some ways, but made me even more suspicious. I moved out of the hotel soon after that. I found a new job and a new place to live, trying to put the experience behind me. But about a year later, While I was scrolling through the local news, I saw a familiar face on the front page, the owner of the hotel. He had been arrested after getting to female guests drunk at the bar and sneaking into their rooms while they were passed out. The women woke up to find him standing there just like I had experienced, preparing to assault them. They screamed, and thankfully the police were called. Looking back, I'm 99% sure it was him in my room that night. I'm relieved that nothing worse happened to me, but the thought still haunts me. How many other nights had he entered my room without me knowing? What about the nights I had too much to drink and blacked out, only to wake up with no memory of what had happened? It's a terrifying thought, and I can't help but wonder how many other guests at that hotel had similar experiences without even realizing it. On Sunday, October 29th, 2022, after a pleasant weekend visiting family and enjoying time with my girlfriend, we returned home from our drive. We grabbed some McDonald's and settled in front of the TV. At 9 p.m., my phone rang with an unknown number starting with 07. Normally, I ignore such calls, especially late at night, due to past harassment issues from school. However, a strange feeling prompted me to answer. Thinking it might be important, I picked up and said hello. The voice on the other end immediately asked, "Are you the son of Daniel Truckmuch?" I confirmed, not finding it unusual, since my father, a salesman for 35 years, used to have my number. Occasionally, old clients call me by mistake. The caller then said, "Your father had a car accident." Panic surged through me. My girlfriend noticed my distress immediately. The tone of the caller suggested that my father might be dead. I asked for details. Where did it happen? How? And who was calling? The caller claimed to be a witness and mentioned that my father was taken to the hospital. My fear escalated as I demanded more information. The caller said the car had flipped, but was vague about the location. When I asked for specifics, he mentioned a road number and then said it was towards Angers. Realizing that it was impossible for my father to have traveled from Grenoble to Angers in just 4 hours, I started to panic. My girlfriend, quick thinking, called my father's mobile. To our immense relief, my father answered casually, saying he was on his couch watching football. I returned to the caller and told him that my father was fine. He seemed confused and asked if I was Matthew Truckmuch. I replied that there was no Matthew in my family and that I was Joan. The caller apologized in a manner that felt unsettling, as if he had intended to cause panic. He dodged my repeated questions about how he obtained my number and said, "Sorry for scaring you." Before hanging up, I tried to investigate later and discovered that the number was no longer assigned. The caller had claimed my number was listed on a directory, but despite a thorough search, we found no trace of it online. The caller had also mentioned a Laurent and apologized for his clumsiness, stating that he managed to contact my father's wife and that the person involved was deceased. My sister-in-law, a surgeon, confirmed that it's the firefighters who contact families in such cases, not random people. There was no press article or obituary about an accident involving my father. To this day, I am left with unsettling questions. Was it a cruel joke? Did someone simply want to see me panic? How did they get my number? The memory of that call still gives me chills. I was 25 at the time, and this took place in 2018. My boyfriend, now my husband, and I were living in our hometown, a small city that wasn't particularly remarkable except for the usual small-town issues: poverty, some drug problems, and not a whole lot to do. On this particular Saturday night, my boyfriend was at a friend's house, about 2 towns over, which was roughly a 20-minute drive from where we lived. He told me he'd be home by around 9, so I wasn't expecting anything unusual. We lived in a duplex at the time, an old house that had been split into 2 apartments, one upstairs ours and one downstairs. My cousin rented the downstairs apartment, and since she had a bit of a loud personality, I always knew when she was home or out. On this particular night, she wasn't home, so the house was unusually quiet. Our street was situated in such a way that the back of the houses on my street faced a narrow alley, which was also where the driveways were. This alley separated our street from the parallel one behind us, so most of the traffic was hidden away from the front of the house. The downstairs unit had a front porch and a side door, while our upstairs unit could only be accessed by an outside set of wooden stairs that led to the back door. It was around 8:30 p.m., and I was home alone watching TV. I heard footsteps coming up the wooden stairs and a knock on the door. It wasn't unusual for my boyfriend to come home early, so I figured maybe they got bored at his friend's house or decided to call it a night. Normally, when he came home, I'd unlock the door for him rather than have him fiddle with his keys in the dark. Without thinking, I got up and opened the door. But instead of my boyfriend standing there, I found myself face to face with a stranger. He was a thin man, wearing oversized jeans and a hoodie. His appearance startled me. He had a bout for teeth and was swaying on his feet as though he was under the influence of something. I froze for a second, shocked that this was not my boyfriend. The man looked at me and asked, "Can I use your phone?" My heart started pounding. Behind him, I could see a large SUV, something like a Ford Explorer, idling in the alley with someone sitting in the driver's seat. Something about the situation felt deeply wrong. The guy, his appearance, the idling car, it all screamed danger. Instinctively, I responded, "Yeah, hold on," and immediately shut and locked the door. Once inside, I hid behind the front door so he couldn't see me through the window. I was frozen in place, trying to process what had just happened. A sense of unease crept over me. There was no way this was a simple request for a phone. My gut was telling me that something was off. A few minutes passed, and I heard the man slowly descend the stairs. I crept over to the door and peered out, just in time to see the SUV drive away down the alley, disappearing into the night. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more unsettled. I immediately called my boyfriend and told him what had just happened. He offered to leave right away and come home, but he was already about to head back since it was almost 9. He arrived about 20 minutes later, and I tried to calm myself down, though my nerves were still rattled. Once he was home, I started to feel a bit silly. Why didn't I just give the guy my phone? Was I overreacting? But the more I thought about it in the days that followed, the more unsettling the situation seemed. It was 2018. Why didn't he or the person in the car have a phone of their own? Most people had smartphones by then, even in small towns. And it wasn't like their car was broken down or anything. What did they need a stranger's phone for? Even more strange was the fact that they came down the alley, which was unusual for someone unfamiliar with the area. Why didn't they knock on my cousin's front door downstairs, the more obvious and accessible entrance? I hadn't heard anyone on the front porch, and from what I could see, they hadn't gone to any of the other houses on the street. It was like they had specifically targeted our back door, even though there wasn't a car in our driveway to indicate anyone was home. To make matters worse, our battery-powered security camera had died earlier that day, so there was no footage of the man or the vehicle. It felt like an eerie coincidence that the camera wasn't working when this creepy stranger showed up. I kept replaying the scenario in my mind, and each time I became more convinced that something wasn't right. There was no reasonable explanation for why this guy was at my door in the dark asking to use a phone, and the fact that they left the street entirely without trying any other houses made it feel like they weren't there by accident. I couldn't shake the feeling that had I let that man into my house or handed him my phone, something much worse could have happened. In the end, I never found out who they were or what they really wanted, but the encounter left a lasting impression. It was a reminder that sometimes listening to your gut can be the difference between staying safe and walking into danger. So, to the creepy man at my door that night, let's never meet again. Hey everyone, I've been lurking on Reddit for a while now, but never really had anything interesting to share until now. Here's a story that happened to me recently that I can't shake off. For some background, I'm a 17-year-old guy. Though I've been told I look way older, some people have compared me to being 28, which sucks. One day, my friends and I decided to head to Far Rockaway Beach in NYC. It was evening, and the idea popped up to come back another day around 3 or 4 a.m. to catch the sunrise and enjoy the cool morning air by the water. Now, here's where things get creepy. I decided to pull an all-nighter because I had just started talking to this girl and figure it was the perfect excuse to stay on the phone with her for a long time. I had to leave my house at around 3 a.m. to make it to the beach in time for the sunrise. But as I was getting ready to leave, I felt this heavy sense of unease, like something was off. You know that gut feeling that something might go wrong? Yeah, that. So I'm skating through a park near my house on my way to catch the bus. Out of the corner of my eye, I spot this man in the distance, slowly walking toward me. Eventually, he comes closer and asks me to stop. Now, in hindsight, I know stopping at 3 a.m. in a park isn't the brightest idea, but I wanted to be nice. I guess that's my mistake. He starts talking, but his accent made it hard to understand what he was saying. All I could really catch were his bizarre compliments, and this is where it gets really weird, his insistence that he wanted to massage me. Okay, I know that sounds super strange, but in New York, you kind of get used to random odd encounters. So it didn't fully register how creepy the situation was at first. What started to really freak me out was how he kept inching closer and closer, slowly but surely. As I decided to finally walk away, I could feel his eyes burning into my back. I was so freaked out that I turned around to check, and there he was, walking backward but still keeping eye contact with me. It felt like his stare was stabbing me in the back. I freaked out and ran, skating as fast as I could down the nearest hill to put distance between us. The entire encounter happened while I was on the phone with the girl, so she heard the whole thing. The man's strange attempt to talk to me, and whatever his intentions were. I honestly have no idea if he wanted to kidnap me, hurt me, or something else entirely. But whatever it was, to that man, whatever you were up to that night, let's never meet again. I 23F and my friend to 1F arrived at our hostel in Poland, only to find we couldn't get the door open despite having the code. Two men who claimed they were also staying there offered to help us, but we couldn't get in until someone else came out of the building. Initially, the guys were friendly and helped us carry our luggage up the stairs to the hostel. Surprisingly, there was no one at the check-in desk, even though the owner had specifically asked us to check in at that time. Since we knew which room we were supposed to be in, the men offered to show us to our room. We introduced ourselves and learned that they were 32 and 33, while we shared our ages as well. After a brief chat, they left us to get settled. However, we realized we couldn't lock our door or even enter the building without proper keys since we hadn't officially checked in. Things quickly took a turn for the worse. We were already uneasy about the hostel, which seemed to be a converted apartment, but the low price was appealing. Soon after, we heard a knock on our door, and, without waiting for a response, the two men barged back in. The younger one started chatting about going out that night and asking us more personal questions. My friend and I exchanged worried looks. Then things got even stranger. The younger man mentioned that he thought I was in charge because my friend looked young and proceeded to stroke his hand down her cheek. He then revealed that he had just done some cocaine and offered us some, which we both firmly declined. Desperate to get him out of the room, I tried to back him towards the door, but he resisted and continued talking, making it hard for me to close the door completely. Eventually, I managed to get the door shut and used my body to hold it closed. Meanwhile, my friend tried calling the owner repeatedly without success. Realizing we had to get out of there, we decided to book another hostel. We waited until the men left, quickly packed up, and moved to our new accommodation. We're now in the process of getting a refund for our original booking. When I was 15, my family moved to a new city and found a lovely house. My parents stayed on the first floor, which also had the kitchen and living room, while my brother and I had rooms on the ground floor. These rooms opened up to a game room that had 3 small windows. That detail is important. During the first week after our move, I was so tired one night that I crashed early while scrolling through TikTok. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up with this strange, uncomfortable feeling, like someone was watching me. The room was completely dark, and I just lay there for a while, not moving, trying to figure out what was wrong. Eventually, I grabbed the remote control and closed the shutters on my windows, hoping that would ease my mind, but the feeling didn't go away. It lingered like there were eyes on me in the dark, and I couldn't shake it. I tried distracting myself by playing my electric guitar unplugged, drawing, and reading, but nothing helped. By the time 4 a.m. rolled around, I hadn't slept in 2 hours, and I wasn't even close to falling asleep. I decided to put on some music and scroll through my phone until I eventually dozed off. I put on my headphones, trying to calm myself down, when suddenly I heard a tapping sound. It was faint at first, coming from the game room, which was right behind my bedroom door. I turned off my music and took off my headphones, freezing in place. The tapping got louder, more aggressive, and then I heard a voice, almost a whisper, saying, "Hey, hey." At that moment, panic surged through me. I quickly grabbed my phone and called my mom, hoping she would wake up. Thankfully, she answered. I whispered everything to her, barely able to get the words out. She came downstairs with my dad, and together we went outside to check. There was no one there, but under the window we found some plants that had been trampled and were lying on the ground, proof that someone had been outside. To this day, we still don't know who it was or what they wanted, but the memory of that night still haunts me. When I was 15, I had plans to go to the movies with my friends one afternoon. My parents were working, so I was on my own for the day. In my rush to meet my friends on time, I made a huge mistake. I forgot to lock the front door. I didn't realize this until after the movie ended and I was on my way home. I got back around 5 p.m., knowing my parents wouldn't be home until later, around 8. As soon as I walked through the door, it hit me that I had left the house unlocked. Feeling a little uneasy, I hurried up to my room, trying to shake off the weird feeling. I figured the best way to calm down was to distract myself. So I opened Netflix and started watching a horror movie. Probably not the best idea in hindsight. About halfway through the movie, I suddenly heard footsteps coming up the stairs towards my room. At first I thought I was just being paranoid, but then I realized it couldn't be my parents. They wouldn't be home for hours. My son and I, he's 14, decided to go mushroom hunting last weekend, especially since it had finally started raining. We usually go earlier in the day, but this time it was much later than usual, and with the early sunsets, we knew we had limited time. Our goal was to quickly hit a trail leading to the river, hoping to find some turkey tails or chanterelles. However, we took a wrong turn and found ourselves walking through a large field. It wasn't a huge issue, as the trail still looped back to the main one that eventually led to the river. As we walked toward the main path, we realized that we were now the only ones left. The last group of hikers had already left, so it was just me and my son. That's when we saw him out of a side trail from the thicket. This strange man appeared. He had a small dog beside him, alert but silent. The man stood there, staring directly at us, which immediately sent a chill down my spine. His stare felt wrong, unsettling. Then he raised his hand and gave us the slowest, creepiest wave I've ever seen. I felt a jolt of discomfort, goosebumps forming on my arms, but I didn't want to seem rude. I hesitated, then gave a half-hearted wave back. I whispered to my son to slow down, not wanting us to meet up with a man at the junction of the trails. We dawdled for a full minute, inspecting random plants, hoping he would continue walking ahead. Thankfully, he eventually turned and started walking down the trail toward the main path. I kept my guard up as we cautiously followed behind at a slower pace. The trail curved to the right, and I had this sinking feeling in my gut that if this were a creepy movie, the man would be waiting for us around the corner. Well, life imitates art, because sure enough, as we approached the junction, there he was. He was standing off to the left, just staring at us, not moving an inch. To the right was the path leading to the river, about a 0.6-mile trail, and all I wanted was to take that right turn and get away from him. I glanced at my son, and we both exchanged nervous looks, muttering under our breath about how creepy this guy was. We joked that, even if it came to a chase, we could probably outrun him. He looked older, maybe in his 50s, with greasy hair, tiny round glasses, a blue windbreaker, and plaid long shorts. His dog, a small beagle mix, was just standing there, as silent as its owner. As we approached, I figured I'd try to break the tension. I asked, "Are you okay?" No response. He just kept staring at us, his expression blank, like he was some sort of emotionless zombie. It was beyond unsettling. I tried not to show my discomfort, but every instinct in my body was screaming to get out of there. We made a wide right turn onto the river trail, and I kept my phone camera facing me so I could see over my shoulder. The only movement he made was to slightly turn, keeping us in his line of sight. We didn't stop or look back until we were a block away. When we returned later, he was gone, no longer standing at the junction or on the main trail. It was like he had vanished. To the weird, staring man in the forest, let's never meet again. It was either 2000 or 2001, and I had just moved to Southern California for college. My roommate and I, both in our early 20s, decided one weekend that it would be fun to drive into Mexico, specifically Tijuana. It wasn't that far of a drive, maybe a couple of hours, and we had never been before. One Saturday, we hopped in the car and made the trip. After parking, we headed straight into a restaurant. I think it might have been Senior Frog's, but I'm not entirely sure anymore. We loaded up on tacos, beer, and tequila, and ended up getting pretty drunk. It was probably mid-afternoon by then. The sun was still shining, and we were in high spirits. Our plan was simple: sober up as the day went on, then head back home around dusk. But as we staggered out of the bar onto the street, we were approached by this short, stocky Hispanic guy. He was around 5'2", maybe in his 30s, and dressed like Louis from Revenge of the Nerds, white button-up shirt, trousers pulled up to high, socks showing, the whole nerdy ensemble. But despite the dorky get-up, I noticed he had some hardcore tattoos on his neck, which threw me off. He introduced himself in a friendly manner, almost like he was some kind of unofficial tour guy. He asked if we were from out of town and offered to show us the local spots. We brushed him off with a polite no thanks and kept walking. Still, he stuck to us like glue, following us as we wandered through the busy streets. He kept recommending bars, clubs, and eventually strip joints. We ignored him for the most part, thinking he was just a persistent promoter. At some point, we started drifting into a more secluded part of town. I didn't even realize how far we had wandered from the main area until it was too late. But this guy was always right there beside us, keeping the conversation going. I don't know what changed, but somehow he convinced us to check out one of the strip joints he'd been mentioning. We reluctantly agreed and walked over. But when we got there, my roommate wasn't allowed in because he didn't have his ID on him. So we moved on. That's when things took a darker turn. He asked if we were interested in drugs. Like an idiot, I said yes. He told us to follow him to another bar, one even further out of the way. My roommate looked at me like I was crazy and whispered, "What the hell are you doing?" But we kept following the guy anyway. Despite the growing sense of unease, we ended up in a dingy, two-story bar. He instructed my roommate to wait at the bar while he led me to the bathroom. Inside, we ducked into one of the stalls, and he asked me how much I wanted. I only had $20 on me, so I handed it over. A few moments later, another guy entered the bathroom and passed the tour guide a small bag of drugs, which he handed to me. I quickly pocketed it, feeling an overwhelming urge to leave immediately. Just as I was about to make my exit, the guy blocked my path and said, "What about the $20 you owe me?" I told him I already paid, but he reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $1 bill, and said, "Nah, you only gave me this." Panic set in. I had no more money. I was cornered. Just then the bathroom door opened, and my roommate walked in. He went straight to the urinal, oblivious to the situation. The guy asked if my roommate had any money, and I played dumb. He then suggested that we go to an ATM, and I, feeling trapped, agreed. We left the bar, now back on the street, and I whispered to my roommate to give me $20. He didn't understand what was happening, but eventually handed over the cash. When we were nearing an ATM, I turned to the tour guy, feeling slightly more confident because we were in a more populated area. I gave him the $20 and told him to leave us alone. He took the money and, instead of walking away, demanded more. Now fed up, we started walking faster, heading toward the crowded shopping area. The guy followed, growing more aggressive, and at one point he grabbed my wrist, attempting to take my watch. I yanked my arm free and kept walking. Just when we thought we'd shaken him, he yelled out cholos to two men who had just exited a nearby market. The three of them began running towards us. The cholos grabbed me, pinning me to the wall, while the tour guide pressed a BIC ballpoint pen into my neck, demanding my watch. One of the cholos started patting me down, searching for it. I quickly pulled it from my pocket and handed it over, desperate to get out of the situation. They immediately started fighting over the watch on my roommate, and I made a run for it. We didn't stop running until we reached our car. I threw the drugs away, and we sped back across the border, grateful to have escaped with our lives. To the tour guide and his gang of thugs, let's not meet again. It's been over a decade since this happened, but the memory still gives me chills. It was a hot summer day, and I won 1F, my sister 9F, and a friend of ours, 11F, decided to spend the day at a park, like kids often do. The park was a little far from our neighborhood, but back then it was common for kids to walk or take the bus without adult supervision. It took us about 30 minutes to walk there, and we spent the next few hours playing and even bought ice cream before heading home. As we strolled back, laughing and singing silly songs, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind us. When I turned around, I saw a man walking a short distance away. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but I looked again. Something was wrong. He was wearing a long black coat, black shoes, a hat, and sunglasses. Now, this was in the middle of August, and it was sweltering, so that coat struck me as odd. But what really freaked me out was that I noticed his bare calves and ankles. He wasn't wearing any pants. He was getting closer. I whispered to my friend that I thought the man was following us. She turned around, and her face said it all: panic. The road we were walking on had no houses, just woods on both sides, and we couldn't figure out where he had come from. Even though I was young, I knew we needed to test whether he was actually following us. So, trying to stay calm, I tapped my sister's shoulder and yelled, "Tag, you're it." We started running, with my sister close behind as we picked up speed. I glanced back and, sure enough, the man started running too. My heart dropped. I screamed at my sister and friend to run faster, and we sprinted as hard as we could. My sister, smart for her age, started crying when she realized what was happening. We were fast, and we knew the shortcuts through our neighborhood, but that didn't stop the panic. We kept running until we literally crashed into a man. It was an old, homeless guy who was well known in our neighborhood for selling trinkets. Everyone liked him, and he was harmless. We screamed, pointing at the man still chasing us, who then abruptly stopped. The old man quickly took control, rushing us to safety. He told us not to worry and said he would take care of it. We ran to my friend's house, where her grandmother did her best to calm us down. The old man later told my grandmother that he stopped the guide and pretended to sell him some broken watches, giving us time to escape. He also said he was sure the man was naked under his coat and probably had far worse intentions. The man cursed at him and stormed off in the opposite direction. Word spread around the neighborhood, and parents became extra cautious, warning their kids to be mindful of strangers. Thankfully, there were no more incidents after that. To the creepy man in the coat, let's never, ever meet again. This happened over a decade ago, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was around 11 or 12 at the time, living in a semi-detached house with my mom, dad, and sibling. Our home was decent-sized, but the most impressive feature was our garden, which was spread across 3 levels. The first level was concrete, the second was grass, and the third had my trampoline. Beyond the garden was a tree-covered embankment that backed onto a hill. One early morning, I woke up to the sound of something cracking outside, like a branch snapping. Just a week earlier, a tree from the embankment had fallen into our neighbor's yard, so I immediately thought it had happened again. My bedroom faced the garden, so I quickly opened my curtains to check. But what I saw sent a chill down my spine. A man was hiding in one of the trees at the back of our garden. He was pale with blonde hair and wearing all black clothing. He was looking right at me, and I realized he must have seen the movement of the curtains. As soon as our eyes met, he smirked and gestured for me to come toward him, curling his finger in a creepy come-here motion. I was paralyzed with fear. My heart raced, and I couldn't even scream. Somehow I managed to shout for my mom and dad, my voice cracking with panic. My dad rushed into the room within 30 seconds, but by that time the man had ducked behind the trees and was out of sight. I was in tears, completely shaken. My dad went outside to check the garden, but of course the stranger had already disappeared. After that, things slowly returned to normal, and the incident started to fade from my mind. I chalked it up to some weirdo passing through, hoping that would be the last time I'd ever see him. But I was wrong. About 3 months later, my mom and I were watching TV after school when the doorbell rang. My mom got up to answer it, and I peeked out of the living room window, noticing a white van parked outside. It looked exactly like my uncle's van, so I walked toward the door expecting to greet him, but when I got to the porch, I froze. It wasn't my uncle at the door, it was the man from the garden, the same pale face, the same blonde hair, the same unsettling smirk. My stomach dropped. He recognized me immediately and gave me that same creepy grin as if he was enjoying my fear. I was so terrified I couldn't even tell my mom what was happening. He casually asked if my mom needed any work done on our driveway. She politely declined, and without giving her a business card or anything, he walked back to his van and drove off. He didn't knock on any of the neighbors' doors, which only made the situation feel even more wrong. That as soon as he was gone, I told my mom it was the same guy from the garden. Her face turned pale, and I could tell she was unsettled too. But we didn't know what to do, so we let it go, hoping that was the end of it. Then, about a month later, things escalated again. I had just started my first job delivering newspapers. I worked with my best friend at the time, and we had over 300 papers to deliver, so it was a big job. By this point, it was winter, and it would get dark by around 4:30 p.m. One evening, we were halfway through our deliveries. It was pouring rain, and the streets were nearly empty when I noticed a van slowly creeping behind us. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I realized it was matching our pace. After about a minute, I recognized it was the same white van and the same guy was behind the wheel. Panic set in, and I told my friend we had to move fast. We left the newspaper trolley behind and started speed walking up the hill toward my house, which was about 10 minutes away. I immediately called my mom, who told us to head to a nearby corner shop and wait for her. She left the house and stayed on the phone with us, trying to keep us calm. When we got to the shop, the van suddenly sped off, disappearing into the night. I was shaking from the adrenaline, and I knew this was no coincidence. We reported everything to the police, who came to our house to take a full statement. They told us they'd keep an eye on the area, but I never saw the man or his van dash again. To this day, I remember that guy's face so vividly. His creepy smirk, the way he followed me and my friend, and how he seemed to appear out of nowhere, always watching. I'm just grateful nothing worse happened. To the creepy stranger who stalked me. Let's never meet again.